Committee will come to order. We have another busy day ahead of us today. We will begin with H.R. 1868, the bill to protect Medicare from painful automatic cuts. This is what we pledged to do during the consideration of the American Rescue Plan. Look, I know my Republican friends did not support the rescue bill. Democrats didn't support the tax cuts that my Republican friends passed when they were in charge. But even then, we came together in a bipartisan way to avoid sequestration cuts to Medicare. There was recognition by Democrats and Republicans of just how devastating these cuts would be then, and I hope there is now as well. It is my expectation that we will come together once again to protect Medicare and all those who rely on it. Second, we will consider H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, a bill that we passed last Congress. This legislation would provide a permanent path to citizenship for more than 2 million dreamers in the United States today, as well as those benefiting from deferred enforcement departure and the hundreds of thousands of immigrants with temporary protected status. The prior administration threw their lives into chaos. I'm glad that we not only have House and Senate majorities today that value what immigrants bring to this country, but also a White House that is committed to just and humane immigration policy. It is time to finally make this bill a reality. Third, we will consider H.R. 1603, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. Nearly 24 Republicans supported and passed this bill last Congress to pave the way for agricultural workers in the United States to earn legal status. It is my hope that we can act once again in a bipartisan way to send this bill over to the Senate, where I hope it will finally get a vote and make it to the president's desk. Fourth, we will consider H.R. 1620, legislation to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. The co-author of the original law is the former chairwoman of this committee, Congresswoman Louise Slaughter. This bill fundamentally changed how our nation confronts domestic violence. Because of it, survivors have been encouraged to step out of the shadows and get the life-changing and sometimes life-saving resources that they need. This reauthorization is long overdue. Lastly, we will consider H.J. Res. 17, removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Our nation has made great strides on women's rights over the years, whether through 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause or statutes banning sex discrimination. We all know that laws can be changed. Facilitating a full ratification of the ERA will finally guarantee women full equal rights under the law. By enshrining this equality in our Constitution, we are ensuring these rights can never, ever be chipped away. With that, I'm happy to turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just ahead of time, since we are considering so many measures, my opening statement's a little long, so please bear with me. We have a lengthy agenda at today's hearing, including 4 bills arising out of the Judiciary Committee and a 5th measure concerning budget sequestration. First measure I'll address is H.R. 1620 to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. As many of you know, the goal of VAWA is near and dear to my heart. It is of great importance to the people of Oklahoma, and particularly the tribal communities, including my own tribe, the Chickasaw Nation. Not only does VAWA provide critical tools for addressing domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking in the broader community, but it also provides specific support for Native American tribes in their efforts to end violence against women in their own communities. With every reauthorization of VAWA comes the opportunity to improve the underlying statute. And I firmly believe that we should be taking up a bill with broad-based bipartisan support. Unfortunately, the majority is putting forward a bill with several provisions that are unnecessarily partisan, which makes this a lost opportunity for Congress to work together to reauthorize this critical law. The last time we adopted this course of action, frankly, the legislation was never enacted into law, and I'm afraid we're running that risk again. Though I'm disappointed that we are not considering a fully bipartisan bill today, I believe that reauthorizing VAWA is too critical and too important for me to oppose the version before us. However, our colleague, Ms. Stefanik, has introduced a clean reauthorization that offers a more expedited path to enactment. I've co-sponsored her legislation, which has also been submitted as an amendment. Given the number of partisan writers in H.R. 1620, offering the House the option of a clean extension is essential. I expect my Republican colleagues from the Judiciary Committee will share their concerns, and it's my sincere hope that we can resolve those issues prior to Senate consideration of this measure. And I hope that if the House again takes up the matter in the 117th Congress, it will be in a bipartisan bill that is drafted with input from both parties. In my personal view, that's the only way in which this legislation can be successfully enacted. The second measure I will discuss is HRES 17, a bill removing the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Like HR 1620, this is a bill that the House passed last Congress and did not move forward in the Senate. And at a glance, it's easy to see why. Rather than a vote on the Equal Rights Amendment or on the principle of equality under the law on the basis of sex, what this resolution actually amounts to is an unconstitutional and illegal end run around the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution. In 1972, both the House and Senate passed the Equal Rights Amendment with the requisite two-thirds majority. At the time, Congress explicitly set a deadline for ratification, requiring that the amendment be ratified within 7 years. That meant that the final deadline for gaining ratification from three-quarters of the states was March 22nd, 1979. But by March 22nd, 1979, only 35 states had ratified the ERA. Of course, 5 of those states had also rescinded their ratifications. And I would be curious to know if the majority thinks those ratifications are legally valid. But now, 42 years after the deadline is passed, the majority is trying to turn back the clock and claim that there should be no deadline at all for the ratification of the amendment. This is a highly unusual and indeed unprecedented step, including a deadline of 7 years for states to ratify a proposed constitutional amendment is not uncommon. And in fact, it's been the usual course for proposed constitutional amendments since the passage of the 18th Amendment, with just 2 exceptions. But what has never been done is what the majority is attempting to do with this resolution, to retroactively, 42 years after the fact, remove the original deadline, which was written as part of the explicit language of the amendment, and to do so by a simple majority resolution of Congress. It is unprecedented and indeed contrary to the text of Article 5 procedures for amending the Constitution. If the majority truly wants to move forward and pass the Equal Rights Amendment as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution, I'm all for having that discussion. But it must be done by following the procedure laid out in Article 5 of the Constitution. It requires hard votes, 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, and the consent of 3/4 of our 50 states. That is the only constitutional way to accomplish that goal, and indeed, that is the only right way to accomplish it. What does not work is what the majority is trying today, an extra constitutional end run around the legal process. The third and fourth items I'll discuss both cover immigration. The first of these is H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, intended to address an issue that's been vexing Congress for the last several years. The bill before us purports to grant relief to people affected by DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program. The bill also includes provisions relating to temporary protected status and deferred enforced departure. And unfortunately, while I too want to see a solution for DACA recipients, I do not think this bill is the appropriate solution. H.R. 6 is the same partisan package we considered last year that went nowhere in the Senate. It provides incentives for people to keep crossing the border illegally and for criminal enterprises to continue to use minors to sneak into the country illegally, knowing that their actions may well be wiped away in a few years. It fails to address the real need for additional security measures on the southern border. And above all, it's not the kind of comprehensive and bipartisan solution to immigration that the nation so desperately deserves. Mr. Chairman, there's a real crisis on the southern border, both a humanitarian crisis and a security crisis. That crisis began during the Obama administration and continued through the Trump administration, is now continuing on into the Biden administration. The solution to that crisis and the DACA issue is the same, a comprehensive bill that strengthens border security, provides relief for DACA recipients, and ensures a fair and just immigration system. Unfortunately, that's not what this bill is. I believe we can do better, and I hope someday in the near future I will be speaking in favor of a comprehensive bipartisan immigration bill here at the Rules Committee. I hope that day comes sooner rather than later. Our fourth bill, H.R. 1603, establishes a certified agricultural worker program for alien farm workers, and reforms the H-2A temporary worker visa program, especially for agriculturally focused districts like my own. Providing stability and certainty to farm workers and farm employers is very important. Many of my Republican colleagues on the Judiciary Committee have expressed their concern with certain provisions in this bill. I share some of those concerns. I look forward to hearing their perspective and concerns, and I encourage the committee to grant a rule both on this bill and our other measures that ensures all members have a chance to be heard and have their amendments considered on the floor. Finally, we are also considering H.R. 1868, a bill that will address a variety of issues related to the budget and to sequestration of mandatory spending, including Medicare. The bulk of this bill is intended to address a consequence of last week's passage into law of the majority's partisan reconciliation spending package. As a result of the increased spending, statutory pay-go sequestration cuts will automatically take effect unless Congress acts. While Republicans and Democrats alike agree that it's important to ensure cuts in mandatory spending like Medicare do not take place, it's disappointing the Democrats have chosen not to work with Republicans in putting together a bipartisan bill. There was an opportunity to do so here, but once again, the majority has missed the mark. And let's not get carried away with arguments that somehow Republicans got a lot of help from Democrats in dealing with this problem after the Tax Cut Act in 2017. The reality is only 14 Democrats bothered to, quote, help on that. With all due respect to all concerned, none of those Democrats are either on this panel or appearing as witnesses today. So please, for help on that front, ring a bit hollow. We have missed a chance all too often in this Congress, Mr. Chairman, to work together. And the 5 bills before us today do little to fix that unfortunate record. I hope the majority will change course soon and see the merits of truly working with Republicans on bipartisan measures to benefit the entire country. I remind everyone that none of the matters we're considering today are going to be subject to reconciliation. They will require bipartisan cooperation. You simply can't do it by jamming them through. So that's a lesson I think we all need to take to heart. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to today's hearing and our witnesses' testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to yield to the chairman of the Budget Committee, Mr. Yarmouth, to hear his testimony in H.R. 1868 to prevent across-the-board direct spending cuts and for other purposes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. The bill language before us today is familiar. Over the past year, Congress has delivered multiple critical and necessary COVID relief packages to address the real emergencies facing the American people and our economy. Each time, statutory pay-go was waived because members on both sides of the aisle understood the pressing need for relief, as well as the dire impact sequestration would have on our nation's seniors, students, and farmers. Because pay-go requirements cannot be changed in reconciliation bills, an additional legislative fix is needed to avert these painful and indiscriminate cuts to Medicare, farm supports, and other programs. Today's bill will ensure the American Rescue Plan is treated the same as previous relief measures, including the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act, and can be considered the final step in this reconciliation process. This final step was also needed, as has been mentioned, in 2017, when Republicans used reconciliation to pass the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Following the bill's party line passage in both the House and Senate, Republicans proposed the same legislative fix, and Democrats voted with them to avoid harmful across-the-board cuts, despite our opposition to the tax cuts. Even in the wake of contentious legislation, Congress has come together to prevent sequestration and protect Medicare and other programs. This time should be no different. Economic experts, health professionals, educators, local leaders, and the American people themselves were united in support of the American Rescue Plan. They understood the urgent need for bold action to end the pandemic, help families survive these crises, and to generate a strong and inclusive recovery. Its passage shows that Congress has finally learned its lesson from past crises, that doing too little will cost us far more in the end. And this lesson is already paying off. by not allowing our recovery to be derailed by unfounded fears of debt and instead delivering the relief our nation needed, economists now believe our fiscal future is brighter than ever. They estimate that the American Rescue Plan will propel the U.S. economy to its fastest annual growth in at least 4 decades, reduce poverty, and bring us back to near full employment by 2022. With these growth projections, interest rates expected to remain at record lows, and the Fed ready to handle inflation risks, there is simply no evidence to suggest or even hint at an immediate debt crisis. The real immediate crisis is sequestration. What we can't afford are the impending and debilitating cuts to Medicare and these other programs, which will happen if Congress does not act. And that's what we're here to address today. Presumably, no one wants to see these critical programs upended, especially now in the throes of the pandemic. Despite any differences between our two sides over how best to respond to the challenges facing our nation, we should be able to agree that our commitments to our nation's seniors, students, and farmers during this difficult time is a shared priority. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. Last week, while Washington Democrats were jamming through their $1.9 trillion bailout package, we were warning that among the numerous reasons not to pass that plan was the fact that its very enactment threatened cuts to Medicare. Sadly, the White House and many leaders were determined to pursue a partisan process to bail out political allies under the guise of COVID relief. Well, let's be clear. What we are not here debating is a fix to the Democrats' problem because their $1.9 trillion bailout bill was necessary for the good of the country. With these cuts being just some unfortunate consequence, less than 9% of their plan will even go toward crushing the virus and putting shots in arms. Billions will go to states that either don't need the money or to reward and incentivize lockdown policies that are destructive to the physical, mental, and financial health of their communities. And let's not forget, the Congressional Budget Office said that absent any new funding, the U.S. economy is slated to reach pre-pandemic levels of real GDP growth by the middle of this year. Unemployment is projected to continue to decline. This year, it is estimated we will see the highest economic growth in more than 15 years, all without the spending in the $1.9 trillion bailout bill. In other words, Democrats have passed a bill to take credit for an economic recovery that's already underway. And they've done so knowing it would trigger cuts to Medicare. And so here we are, debating how do we protect seniors from cuts that could happen because of actions our Democrat colleagues took. The good news, there are ways to protect America's seniors. Stop these cuts to Medicare and make sure we do so in a more responsible way by finding savings elsewhere. To help cover the cost of these cuts so we can responsibly protect America's seniors, we could avoid sending checks to folks in prison. In fact, nearly 2 million folks in prison are getting checks, or allowing benefits to get to those in the country illegally. We could take some of the billions that Democrats want to send to states to bail out governments and reward and incentivize harmful and destructive lockdowns and put the money to better use, protecting seniors on Medicare from these cuts. There are no doubt other savings to be found and cuts that could be made within the $1.9 trillion bailout bill. Republicans have said all along, don't do this $1.9 trillion bailout bill and put America's seniors in jeopardy. But since Democrats felt their political agenda was more important, we are where we are today. Let's take a more responsible path forward. We can do this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I just find it somewhat interesting that my Republican friends when it comes to tax cuts, mostly for wealthy people, people well connected and well off, they had no problem with waiving sequestration rules. But when it comes to a bill to put vaccines in arms, put kids back into school, help a lot of people who are struggling with food insecurity get food, including a lot of senior citizens, putting people back in their jobs, then all of a sudden, this is a big problem. Again, we just have a different set of values, I think. I'm happy to yield now to the ranking member for any questions or comments he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith, I want to ask about the delay to the Medicare sequester that's included in the bill. It's my understanding that we've, again, previously delayed this sequester a number of times, including in the Bipartisan CARES Act we passed last year. It's clear that we all knew, as you suggested in your testimony, that this was coming with a deadline of March 31st. Seems odd to me that Democrats waited until the last minute to deal with the issue and then paired it with provisions that caused Republicans significant concerns, like ignoring the direct spending effects of their own partisan reconciliation bill. The Democrats try to work with you or your colleagues on the Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce committees to come up with some bipartisan agreement on how to pay for this further Medicare sequester?
No, they haven't, Mr. Cole.
Do you have some ideas that you could or would suggest to deal with if that opportunity were afforded to you?
You know, absolutely. I think that it would be very easy for us to come to some bipartisan agreement. I gave the statement of the over $2 million prisoners that are getting the $1,400 checks. That comes to almost $2.8 billion. Think about that. You could look at the $12 billion in foreign aid that was sent. You could look at the millions of dollars that were sent to the National Endowment of Arts, the National Endowments of Humanities. There's numerous items, Mr. Cole, that we could work together on. To say that there's not some horrible pork that was in a $1.9 trillion bill to find where we could pay for these cuts. Everyone can answer, yes, we can. And so we're willing to work with our colleagues in any way to make sure that these seniors are not are facing these cuts. But just a blanket, like, let's discharge the credit card. We spent $2 trillion and let's not try to fix it. That's not the way that Americans want us to govern, and that's not the values of Americans.
I want to shift gears again to this $1.9 trillion pound gorilla in the room. The Democrats' partisan, political reconciliation bill is just enacted into law. I know that Chairman Yarmouth and other Democrats have already started to make the argument, as the chairman made, that even though they disagreed with the policy of the Tax Cuts and Job Act, they still voted in favor of similar provisions which disregarded the impact of the bill to the pay-go score. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond further to that. Do you happen to know how many Democrats helped on that?
Well, listening to your comments, I heard that there was 14, and I heard that no one in this committee helped support that. So
that's
I thought
correct, including the people that are calling for bipartisanship now.
Yeah, I thought that was a very, very good point that you raised, Ranking Member Cole.
Well, thank you. I'll submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, the 14 people who did vote, as you suggested or implied that most Democrats did, because most Democrats did not vote that way. So we ought to have a clear record of those who did. And again, that includes anybody that's calling for the bipartisanship now. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I again asked unanimous consent to submit those names for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, and I probably should just state for the record that when the vote that my colleague is referring to was a continuing resolution back in 2017, and a lot of people didn't support another continuing resolution. We wanted an omnibus bill rather than another short-term CR. But that doesn't stop the fact that there was bipartisan help to get it over the finish line. And again, I find it just so rich that when it comes to helping people who are struggling, we're being criticized for not cutting something to pay for it. But when it came to tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires and corporations. And my friends brought their waiving sequestration rules before the House. There was no offsets. There were no cuts that were being made. Again, this is a values argument, and I just think that we look at things very differently. I'm happy now.
With all due respect,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, nothing that my friend, the ranking member of the Budget Committee suggested is something that has anything to do with delaying relief from people that need it or slowing up the vaccine distribution. He simply made the point, there's lots of things in $1.9 trillion that were not part of that. There's
Yeah.
lots of things, honestly, billions of dollars in the out years that weren't part of that. So we do think a discussion would have been worth having on this, and we think we probably could have found some common ground. We just regret that didn't happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I wish we could have found common ground on a tax package that benefited the middle class more than it did the rich. So when it comes to $1.9 trillion, when it comes to tax cuts for people well off, we have one standard. When it comes to helping people who are struggling, people in poverty, senior citizens who don't have enough to eat, we have another. Happy to yield to Ms. Torres. Ms. Torres? I don't think, is she might be, okay, well, let me go to Ms. Torres. All right, well, why don't I go to Mr. Perlmutter?
I'm going to pass. Thank you. I just wanted Mr. Cole to see my University of Colorado mask that we're going to wear proudly into the NCAA tournament.
My friend, yield just quickly. I think you'll do better than we do. We have Missouri in the first round. We might slip by them, but if we do, we've got Villanova in round number 2. So I'm rooting for you guys to have a longer run because I think we'll be one and done if we're lucky.
All right. Well, I hope to see you in the finals.
So I don't see Mr. Burgess. So I'll go to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I yield back. I have no questions at this time, but thank you.
So Mr. Raskin.
I've got no questions either, Mr. Chairman, but I do thank you for pointing out the discrepancy and the incompatibility in the position being represented today versus what happened back with the big $1.5 trillion tax giveaway to the wealthiest people and corporations in the country. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
Ms. Fischbach.
There we go. I unmuted. Mr. Chair, I have no questions at this time.
Ms. Scanlon.
I just want to thank Mr. Cole for recognizing the indomitable spirit of Villanova, which is in my district. And of course, as a proud Colgate grad, I'm hoping that they can get past Arkansas. So that's all. I yield back.
So Mr. Morelli, I don't see. Mr. DeSaulnier.
No, I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing that I would add is that I did hear from the AMA in support of this bill. They, of course, were also in support of the American Rescue Plan, and I yield back.
Thank you. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. You're now excused. At this time, I'd like to inform the committee that we will hear any statement, we will hear any amendment testimony on HR 1868 at the end of the hearing. I would now like to call up our next panel to testify on HR 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, and HR 1603, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021. Subcommittee Chairperson Lofgren, Subcommittee Ranking Member McClintock, we're delighted that you are here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules.documents@mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. I would now like to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Chairperson Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. Today, we can take an important step towards enactment of two very important bills, H.R. 6, the American Dream and Promise Act, and H.R. 1603, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. H.R. 6 provides millions of Dreamers temporary protected status, or TPS, and deferred enforcement departure, or DED, recipients the opportunity to obtain lawful status and finally be recognized under the law as the Americans they are. Dreamers and recipients of TPS and DED may have come to the United States in different ways, and they may have had different opportunities once they arrived. But today they are united not only by their dedication to our country, but also by the uncertainty of their futures. It's hard to believe that it was 20 years ago that the DREAM Act was first introduced, and yet, despite bipartisan support in Congress, as well as the support of most Americans, we've thus far been unable to get this bill enacted into law. I have great hope that this year will be different. Turning to H.R. 1603, the Farm Work Modernization Act solves another problem of significant concern: the labor challenges that harm America's farms. Over the past decade, there have been several legislative attempts to fix this issue that failed to pass the House. But H.R. 1603 is different. It provides a comprehensive and balanced solution for the agricultural sector, and it passed the House in 2019 with significant bipartisan support. After months of meticulous negotiations, labor and employers reached an agreement that received broad support from farm worker and immigrant rights organizations, as well as more than 350 agricultural employers and farm groups from around the United States. H.R. 1603 secures the current domestic workforce by providing a process for experienced farm workers in the United States to earn status through continued agricultural employment. The bill also ensures America's farmers have access to future workers by reforming the H-2A program to provide more flexibility for employers while ensuring critical protection for workers. There are many who deserve thanks for their tireless work on these two bills. On H.R. 1603, I would especially like to call out two of my Republican colleagues, Representative Dan Newhouse and Representative Mike Simpson. They were joined by several active Democrats, including Jim Costa, Jimmy Panetta, and Salud Carbajal, but there were many others on both sides of the aisle who worked to craft this measure. H.R. 6 would not be here before us today were it not for the endless work of our esteemed colleagues Lucille Roybal-Allard, Nydia Velasquez, and Yvette Clark. There's much to be proud of in these bills in substance and in process, and I urge my colleagues to support both pieces of legislation that will solve real problems and are good for America. And I would like to thank the chairman for his suggestion that witnesses limit their statements to about 3 minutes to keep these meetings a bit shorter. And I've taken that suggestion to heart, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And that's why I've always thought the world of you. So thank you. I yield to Ranking Member McClintock.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect, I have to wonder if the majority is completely oblivious to the tragedy that's now unfolding on our southern border as a direct result of the promise of admission and amnesty for every person who brings a child and illegally enters our country. Every month since the election, a tidal wave of illegal immigration steadily mounted on the southern border. Last month, we surpassed 100,000 encounters. Now, that's the entire population of Green Bay, Wisconsin, in 1 month. Nearly 9,500 of those encounters were unaccompanied minors. We're approaching over 400,000 encounters so far this fiscal year. That's the population not only of Green Bay, Wisconsin, but also Erie, Pennsylvania, South Bend, Indiana, and Burbank, California combined. And they all say the same thing. Joe Biden promised us, and indeed he did. He ended the migrant protection protocols that required asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their claims were being assessed. Now they're released into the interior to await distant court dates that most of them ignore.
He's stopped enforcing most deportation orders against illegal aliens who committed crimes once here. He promised, and they came. And now we have thousands of children we don't have the capacity to care for. And by the way, they're the lucky ones. They're the ones that survived being placed in the hands of the Mexican crime cartels on a 2,000-mile trail of terror. How in the world can you claim that this is a humane policy? The humane policy is to make it clear to the world that we were serious about enforcing our immigration laws. When President Trump did this, the cartels couldn't convince many people to risk their children on a pointless trip to the border. Meanwhile, American working class wages soared. We've been begging the Immigration Subcommittee chairwoman to hold a hearing to address the Biden border crisis. Instead, we have these bills before us today that actually makes that crisis worse. H.R. 6 offers a special path to citizenship to millions of illegal aliens, as well as to hundreds of thousands of aliens who were supposed to be allowed to stay only temporarily in the United States. It places the interest of those who have broken our laws before the interests of Americans and the legal immigrants who waited patiently in line for green cards to become available. The bill also allows aliens with DUI convictions and those who voted illegally in federal and state elections to get a green card. And it invites immigration fraud by lax documentation requirements that border on the absurd. Have a friend vouch for you. We need to address the DACA population, and many of us supported legislation to give them legal status in the 115th Congress. But that measure was also accompanied by measures that assured enforcement of our immigration laws to discourage another generation of children being brought to our borders, as we're now seeing unfold again today. We'd like you to join us in such a balanced approach. Approving H.R. 6 without enforcing our border sends a powerful message that the cartels are right. You'll be admitted into our country free to await the next amnesty around the corner. Similarly, H.R. 1603, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, is also on today's agenda. This bill deals with another immigration issue that does need reform: seasonal farm labor. The H-2A seasonal agricultural worker visa program is a bureaucratic nightmare for those farmers who use it, but adding more regulation and more liability and broadening eligibility for green cards for work in other sectors that compete against American workers makes a bad situation worse. Ironically, a bill that we're told is to help American farmers is opposed by the American Farm Bureau Federation. I believe the most objectionable provision extends amnesty to at least 1 million illegal alien farm workers. And the farm workers' families who may not even live in the United States get green cards too. And once a farm worker gets a green card, there's no incentive for them to remain employed in agriculture. That means the U.S. labor force will be flooded with low-skilled workers who will compete with Americans for jobs and drive down Americans' wages, while creating labor shortages in agriculture that will demand still more illegal immigrants. The effects of these policies are there for all to see on our southern border today. I think the American people are growing aware of the threat that this poses to their families, their prosperity, and their communities. Let us at least have an open rule so that their representatives can offer amendments to secure our borders and protect our citizens. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me just make a brief comment. I noticed that Minority Leader McCarthy went to the border to criticize Biden's border policies on unaccompanied children. I think he called it disorder at the border. I guess nice rhyme. But to be honest with you, I'd much rather see a little disorder on the way to standing up an effective and a humane system to deal with unaccompanied children than a policy of deliberate, calculated cruelty. Cruelty for cruelty's sake. That's what we saw in the last administration with its policies towards children and families seeking legal asylum at our border. A set of policies about which the Republicans in this House either strongly supported or were notoriously silent. So please, I don't want to see any crocodile tears now and pretend that my friends actually care about these children. The Republican Party has shown time and time again over the past several years that it doesn't care about these kids. You deported them, you blocked their entry, you dumped them alone and defenseless into Mexico's most violent border towns. You kept them in detention for months. You separated from their parents. So, this newfound concern is hard to stomach. And for my part, I stand with Ruben Garcia, who's the director of El Paso's Annunciation House, one of the largest shelter networks in the country, when he asked, can we just agree not to use these human beings in front of us as political pawns? Let's just make sure that they're taken care of. And the bills that we're talking about here today, that Ms. Lofgren testified on behalf of, basically, namely that the millions of immigrants who have grown up, lived, and worked in the United States for decades, that's who they affect. Many of them have held some form of legal status for all or part of that time. They're dreamers, long-term TPS holders, and agricultural workers. They put food on our tables. They are doctors, they are nurses, they are teachers, they are police officers, they are fishermen, farmers, and essential workers. They own and run businesses, providing employment for thousands of Americans. They are law-abiding, tax-paying neighbors. They are our friends. They are a vital part of our communities. They have taken care of us during the pandemic, and they will be an integral part of America's recovery. They have paid their dues, and they have earned a chance at the American dream by seeing their legal status regularized and provided a pathway to citizenship. It's the least we can do for these immigrant constituencies who have contributed so much to America's well-being, and will continue to do so in the future. So, we need to work with the Biden administration to fix a broken immigration system that they inherited, one that has wasted billions of taxpayer dollars and has not kept the American people safe, nor is it adhered to our values, and we will move in that direction. But today, the people we are talking about deserve our help. I yield to Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last Congress, when we considered the Rules Committee print containing the text of two pieces of legislation that were marked up, appears that those two pieces of legislation have been combined into H.R. 6 again. I was disappointed to see that Rules Committee majority is refusing to consider any amendments to this legislation. So my first question, I guess, would be to Ms. Lofgren. Given the fact that we have 60 new members of Congress who did not have an opportunity to participate last year, don't you think it would be appropriate to allow them to present whatever ideas that they think might be considered, and that their perspectives on this legislation would also be important?
Well, I understand that the ranking member did not agree with the rule that was adopted by the House, but it's my understanding that that rule allows for consideration of bills that passed in the last Congress to be considered in this House without going through the markup process again. That provision of the rules is being utilized, and I think there's a great desire to move forward on this. This bill is essentially the same. The only real change is a provision that I think is widely approved, which is the children who had temporary status because their parents had temporary legal status. For example, treaty traders, and I've met some of these kids from Florida, actually, where their parents are investors. They have lawfully held a treaty trader, an e-visa, for multiple years. There's no path from a treaty trader visa to legal permanent residence. The kids grew up here, and yet there's no way. And when they age out of their dependent status, they grew up in America, the country they're from. In this case, it was England. They don't remember England. They don't have anybody in England. Their parents legally reside in the U.S. They're in a bad spot, and this provides for children, young people in that situation, to also be accommodated under the DREAM Act, and that would include H4s, the E dependents, and the L1 dependents. That's the only really policy difference that is in the DREAM Act.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the information. Wasn't quite the question I asked. We have 60 new members who haven't had a chance to participate at all. They haven't been able to offer amendments. We're evidently not going to give them an opportunity to do that. I just asked you if you think that's fair to those members.
Well, I think it's fair for us to follow the rules that the House has adopted.
You think it's a fair rule to those 60 members?
It's not unreasonable, and it's certainly something that's not out of keeping with past practices when the minority was the majority.
Okay. Let me go to you, Mr. McClintock. HR 6 applies well beyond the DACA population. Is that correct? Mr. McClintock, are you muted?
Sorry about that. There we go.
Okay. I don't know if you got my, did you get my question?
Yes, it extends to several million additional individuals who can show that they were in this country, but the documentation required can be as little as a friend's certification.
Do you have any idea how many millions of people we're talking about?
I don't think anybody knows, several millions at least.
Okay. To both our witnesses, obviously we've got a crisis on the southern border right now. Mr. McClintock mentioned that in his testimony. I'm curious, there doesn't seem to be anything in HR 6 that has much to do with that. Is the majority planning to bring forward any legislation on that in the foreseeable future? I'll start with you, Ms. Loughran.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on the situation at the border. I think it's, I heard several members of the minority leader at the border yesterday expressing concern, but I didn't hear concern expressed when for a year the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was ignored. And little children, the TVPRA, which was done on a bipartisan basis, I worked on it along with, I know Congressman Smith in New Jersey took the lead, and it was overwhelmingly approved. And it basically said this: if a small child comes to the border, you have to find out what's happened to that child and move them away from the border station, because some of these children are trafficking victims. For over a year, the Trump administration simply turned a 10-year-old girl who presented at the border back to who knew whatever fate in Mexico. Now, the Biden administration is no longer ignoring the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, and they are trying to comply by inquiring as to what that 10-year-old situation is. There have been a number, we don't know the number of little children that were housed in these squalid camps along the Mexican border. But now that they are able to come, as the law provides, to get safe haven in the United States, there is a buildup. And there has been a need to swarm resources to deal with that. But to say that somehow that is more wrong than turning away an 11-year-old to whatever fate, to me, is mind-boggling.
What's mind-boggling to me is an administration that's pursuing policies that encourages parents to put children in exactly that position.
I would disagree with very much, Mr. Cole, because the other thing that the Trump administration did was to eliminate the Central American Minors Program that allowed for an orderly transport of children who met criteria so that they didn't have to take that.
Well, what we're seeing now is anything but orderly. But let me go to Mr. McClintock, if I may. You're on the relevant committee of jurisdiction. Are you aware if the majority is planning to bring any legislation forward to help deal with the current situation on the southern border?
As I said, we have been begging the chairwoman for a hearing to address this crisis, and so far have been met with silence. The sum total of the Trump administration's policies were to stop children from being used as pawns, handed over to the Mexican crime cartels, and then dragged alone over a 2,000-mile trail of terror. One of the Border Patrol officers told me, these families shell out a year's worth of wages in order to get their children into the hands of the crime cartels to take them to the United States. It says once they're returned, and it said the cartels don't have a refund policy. Once they're returned to their home countries, the word spreads very quickly. Don't risk all of that money and don't risk your child's life because the child is simply going to be returned. And another thing that we don't know is how many of these children are being killed along the way. I saw one study suggesting about a third of the children are subjected to, 2/3 of the children are subjected to some form of violence. 1/3 of the female children are subjected to sexual assault. Trump's policies convinced people not to send their children on that 2,000-mile trip. The policies that are now in place are encouraging them to do so. So when you talk about making children pawns, these policies have made the children the pawns of the Mexican crime cartels. And you cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, call that a humanitarian policy. And at the same time, we also have to ask who's looking out for American children and American families. How are working families helped by flooding the labor market with low-wage illegal labor? How are children helped by packing their classrooms with non-English speaking students who require enormous amounts of teachers' attention? How are our sick and injured helped by emergency rooms that are overcrowded with illegal immigrants demanding care? How are our communities made safer by releasing dangerous criminal illegal aliens onto our streets rather than deporting them? H.R. 6 sends a powerful message that all you have to do is bring a child across the border. They will be admitted. They will not be sent home. And all they have to do is wait for the next DACA to come along.
Got a series of questions for you, Mr. McClintock. Does this legislation remove the ability of the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to consider discretionary factors like lengthy arrest records, but maybe no convictions yet, when adjudicating benefits or waivers?
Yeah, well, my understanding is that the secretary, this is a mandated benefit. In other words, the secretary has no discretion. The secretary can, in certain circumstances, personally, cannot delegate this power, but personally can provide a provisional disapproval, but then that starts a lengthy review process over which they have no final say.
Okay. And would a person who committed fraud or made a false claim of U.S. citizenship to the United States government still be eligible for a green card under this legislation?
Well, among other things, they don't require any more documentation than simply a sworn affidavit from a friend. So the documentation that is in this bill is laughable. And even so, even if they got caught falsifying information, they can simply remove their request and the government can take no further review of that or notice.
So if an individual committed serious crimes as a juvenile, could DHS still be forced to give them a green card under this legislation?
Well, the Democrats will tell you yes, but here's the problem with that. Juvenile records are usually sealed, so there's no way to get at them. So the ability of the authorities actually to document that a minor does have a criminal record is very much hampered. And by the way, they don't have to say whether they have a criminal record or not.
If the legislation was signed into law, can information contained in federal or state gang databases still be used by the Department of Homeland Security to establish a gang participation and thus be the sole basis for denying an application?
The bill specifically says that you cannot use the gang database in order to determine a gang membership. I believe you're not even allowed to use if the individual has gang tattoos. That is not allowed to be used as proof of gang affiliation.
So under H.R. 6, nothing's done to address the humanitarian crisis that's currently going on at the border. Green cards can be given to those who've already lied to the United States government, committed fraud, not to mention other more serious offenses. our law enforcement have zero additional resources, and those here illegally would be treated much better than those trying to come to the United States legally and waiting their turn to do so. Those things fair statements in your view?
I would amend one thing you said, and that is it does nothing to prevent the humanitarian crisis on the border. I'd go a step farther and say it actually encourages the humanitarian crisis on the border by implicitly promising the next generation that all they have to do is get here and their turn will come.
Thank you very much. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And before I yield to Ms. Torres, let me just make a suggestion. And this is something that maybe those of us in the Rules Committee in a bipartisan way can explore. You know, we talk about humanitarian crisis on the border. There is a crisis in these countries in Central America. They're some of the most dangerous places in the world. High gang activity, extreme violence, corruption, impunity. People are sending their kids out of these countries because they're afraid for their lives. Any one of us would do the same thing if it was our kid. That's just the reality. So until we get real about acknowledging the crisis that exists in these countries and the fact that we do not have a policy in dealing a comprehensive policy in Central America. We didn't under Trump. Hopefully we will have one under Biden. And quite frankly, we should have had a better one under Obama. But you know, until we address that reality, you know, we're going to continue to see this. And then the issue for us is how we deal with these kids. And so, I mean, when we talk about these things, they get into this polarizing rhetoric and these assertions that are, that I don't think reflect the reality. And I say that because at some point, Democrats and Republicans are going to have to figure out what our policy towards Central America is and how we can help some of these countries get back on their feet and deal with some of them. Yeah,
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Mr. Cole.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I take my friend at his word, because I know he's sincere in this, and I look forward to working with you on that, because I think you're right.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your comments, as well as Ms. Loughran. Thank you for being before our committee today. As a woman now who was sent to the U.S. as a child because it was, conditions were so dangerous in Guatemala, where I was born, that my parents made that difficult decision to send their youngest daughter to the U.S. to live with my father's oldest brother. I can't even imagine doing that myself as a parent and now as a grandparent. As an American citizen, some of the worst issues and poverty that we see here in the U.S. Even those parents could not comprehend the severity of the problems in the Northern Triangle that would lead a responsible mom and dad to send their child to the U.S. The way my parents, had to send me, and the way many of these unaccompanied children that we would dare call unaccompanied, even though they come with their uncle, as I did, or their brother, or their cousin or a sibling. It is unconscionable that a country like the U.S. Has so much to offer, founded on immigrants that made this their home and have made this great country what it is today, would not see the human side of these young people. I do have to agree with the issue of dealing with the root cause of migration. I hear you 100% on that. I have spent the last 6 years since I've been in Congress dealing with that, dealing with the narco traffickers in the region, narco trafficker governments like Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president of Honduras, who has taken money from people like El Chapo to fund his campaign and to put into his personal bank accounts, dealing with strongmen such as the president of El Salvador and presidents of Guatemala who continue to steal the little bit that they have of their natural resources and budgets. It's the reason why there is no fair judicial system in the region. It is why so many young girls, preteen girls, are taken into custody, by these gang members and drug cartels and forced into prostitution and, other horrific things that as Americans we could never imagine. So, my commitment here is that I will continue to shine the light on these Northern Triangle countries. I am appalled that my Republican colleagues would, not take under consideration the last 4 years of failed policies of the Trump administration, looking away and simply continuing to fund those very corrupt governments. I am not for sending any more hard-earned taxpayer dollars that goes directly into the pockets of those narco traffickers and strongmen. I am for providing assistance to those young people in the region, and I will continue to do that. And I would invite anyone sitting on this committee to join me as part of the Central America Caucus. We don't deal with policy. My goal there is to simply provide as much nonpartisan information as I can to both Republican and Democratic colleagues, so they too can be informed and can help drive the policies that I have introduced over the last 6 years in the region. Because of that commitment, I should also say that many of my Republican colleagues have supported me in those efforts, to the tune that we have cut all funding for the military in Guatemala and Honduras over the last 2 years. And this last fiscal year, we cut off military funding for El Salvador, because you understand that whether it's a military personnel or the national police, it doesn't make sense for our military to be training these military people to protect the narco that comes through those countries into the U.S. So I thank you for that. I want to thank my colleagues for bringing these two pieces of legislation forward. I hope that we can get all of your support, but if not, I want to urge you to continue to work with those of us who understand that we simply cannot help every single person that comes to our southern border. I hear you on that. But we also have to be committed to not looking away to what is happening in the Northern Triangle, and to provide, that assistance that is needed there for people to take back their government from these corrupt elected officials. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess. I don't see him here, so I'll go to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ranking Member McClintock, I just have a question regarding the bipartisanship and the unity that's been talked about for quite a bit. Was there anything that Chairman Nadler did or liberal progressives on the committee to try to negotiate or work with Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, for example, to give relief for DACA, but also have enforcement mechanisms to actually stop illegal immigration in the future?
Well, first of all, the bill has not been heard this session, so anyone who joined the committee this year has had no input on the bill. But going back 2 years, when it was marked up by committee, as I recall, every Republican amendment was voted down on a straight party line vote. And yet we offered time and again, and I offer again, for a comprehensive approach to the DACA participants to assure that they have a legal status in this country, but at the same time, we have secured our borders and enforced our immigration laws to prevent another generation coming here expecting the same remedy years from now.
So it's your summation that this is not only a highly partisan bill, but also one that would actually exacerbate the problem moving forward?
Well, that's the biggest problem, is that it exacerbates the problem. It doesn't solve it. You're going to see more and more children dragged on that terrible, terrible trip because they can be assured of admission when they arrive. That is not a humanitarian policy. I'm very sympathetic of the conditions in the Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, but the sad fact of the matter is the vast majority of the world lives in conditions of poverty and violence that doesn't give them the right or us the ability to absorb all of them into our country. Asylum, which is a very important concept, is achieved as soon as you cross your first international border. That's not what's going on here. Most of these asylum claims have come through many countries before arriving at the United States and demanding asylum. Most of those claims are not legally justified. In fact, make a mockery of our asylum laws. That's why most of these cases, when they finally get to court, are found not to be legally justified. The individuals who often don't show up for their court appearance years after they've been admitted into this country, once they're ordered deported, the president's new guidelines say basically they won't be deported. And again, that makes a mockery of the importance of asylum to people who have actually been targeted by their governments because of their race, religion, or political views.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I appreciate it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter in support of HR 6 from AFSCME and without objection. And I now yield to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses, thank you for your testimony today. Obviously, this is a subject all of us have dealt with for a number of years, and I appreciate Ms. Lofgren's efforts, particularly on the DREAM Act, as well as on the Migrant Farmer Relief Act, or what is it called? Farm Workforce Modernization Act. These are things that really have been worked on for quite some time, and I appreciate them being brought before us because we have to tackle these issues. And I know, Mr. McClintock, you know that they need to be tackled as well. There are differences of opinion as to precisely how to do that, but we must do it. And the fact that Mr. McCarthy is going down to the border and coming up with nice rhymes of disorder at the border, you know, he's obviously has had a fixation lately with Dr. Seuss. But, you know, I mean, from my point of view, you know, the Trump policy was separating, not educating. It was the Republican policy is nothing for dreamers, just plenty of help for people with Beamers, and nothing from the Trump regime for the kids with a big dream. So, I mean, we can all get into rhyming, but this is a much more serious subject than that. And in Colorado, we certainly have a lot of dreamers who have been begging for assistance. They are contributing members to our state, to our communities, top of their class in many instances. And I just appreciate this coming before us. I know there's a difference of opinion on these subjects, but this is a real attempt to deal with DACA kids and dreamers. That is something that should have, you know, that we've been trying to work on for years, whether it's under a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. And I just appreciate Representative Lofgren for bringing these back before us. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fischbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple, and maybe both Chair Lofgren and Ranking Member McClintock can answer. You know, obviously, and I'm going to be focused more on the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. You know, and obviously, viable farm workers workforce is something I hear quite a bit about in my district, in my rural district, and you know, and I am pleased to hear that, contrary to most of the bills that we have seen this year, is that that this has been worked on bipartisanly. But just that being said, I just want to make sure, and both of you can address it. Do you know of opposition to the bill, and what are their concerns if there is opposition?
If I may, Mr. McClintock said earlier that the Farm Bureau opposed the bill. That is no longer correct. They met again just recently and have taken a neutral position on this bill. They were at the table for the 10 months that this was negotiated. There were issues at the end they wish that they were different. I understand that, but this is a compromise between all the parties. And they have now gone, as I understand it, neutral in individual farm bureaus in various states. For example, my own state of California are supporting the bill. I recently saw some rather strident messages of opposition from groups that are widely known as opposed to immigration. The Numbers USA and the FAIR organization that in my 25 years in the House have never once supported any measure that would provide for any relief or legalization in the immigration arena. That's the only area that I am aware of. As I say, well over 350 farm organizations have supported this measure, and the United Farm Workers Union also supports the measure. So it's kind of one of those rare circumstances where if you work at it for a period of a year and get everybody to the table and realize nobody's going to get 100% of what it is they want, you can come up with a compromise that actually is good for the United States and is good for our country and the farms and the farmers and the farm workers. So that's what I know, and I thank the gentlelady for asking. Yield back.
And
Well,
Ranking Member, go ahead.
I'll stand corrected on the Farm Bureau being neutral on the bill that's supposed to help farmers, but they have made their views very clear. They're very concerned about the added liability this imposes on users of the H-2A program, as well as provisions that do not protect them from significant wage inflation. Here's the basic problem. When an illegal qualifies under this new program, they will not only get a green card, but so will their family members be entitled to green cards. And those green cards, although there is a minimal work requirement in the agricultural field, can be used in any occupation. The family members are under no restrictions. The farm worker has a minimal requirement to work in the agricultural sector. What this means is you're going to be flooding the labor market with low wage labor, and that is going to affect every American. Remember, once the Trump administration got control of our borders, that's when we saw the first significant blue-collar wage growth in a generation. The income gap, which had been widening for years, began to narrow because blue-collar wages were going up because the market was not subject to this enormous flood of low-wage labor. This measure opens the floodgates again and encourages another generation to come here illegally.
Thank you, and again, to both of you or whoever wants to answer, but my understanding is this: is that the Farm Bureau is looking, they are seeking improvements to the bill. They're not, I guess, I was, from what I had understood, is they were not entirely convinced that this was the best way to go. But, I just, presently the H-2A workers have an administrative path to addressing resolving employment claims through the Department of Labor, Homeland Security, State and Justice. However, this bill brings changes to resolving employment claims outside of that system. And does this legislation expose farmers in my district to increased risk of litigation? And I understand that was one of the issues that Farm Bureau was looking at. So if you could address that.
Yeah, that's a major issue, and that's exactly what the bill does.
I don't believe it does, if I may. Right now, the H-2A workers are protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act and certain other labor protections. For example, if they're unpaid, they can go to court and get their wages. There's something called the MISFA, the Migrant Worker Protection Act, that H-2A workers have been excluded from. This bill would extend that protection to them. However, most of the protections available are already available under other laws. Here's the thing. MISFA requires mediation. And so if you have a dispute between an employee and employer, you can't just sue, you have to go to mediation. And we know that most of the disputes get solved in mediation. There are misunderstanding, or you want to avoid the court. This actually extends the mediation requirement to our existing workforce, which is to the H-2As, which do not currently have to do the mediation. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. It's just worth pointing out there are no attorney's fees awarded under MISFA, so there's no incentive for people to go out and, in terms of lawyers representing them. There's concern, and I understand there's always concern. No one wants to be in litigation. But if you take a look at the level of litigation in MISFA today, it's almost non-existent. So there's no reason, I understand the fear, but there's no reason to expect that would somehow change because those protections are extended to H-2A workers. We had extensive discussions among all of with the dairy industry that strongly supports this bill, and the fresh and fruit growers and the Western growers and and everybody, change is obviously a cause for anxiety. We all know that as human beings, but in the end, we thought this was a sound measure with a lot of protections. And in terms of the wages, I mean, my goodness, we've got a freeze on wages for a year for the H-2A, the adverse wage rate, and the wage increases are capped. So, without this, the wage increases could go way higher, and in fact have gone higher for the last several years. So this was a compromise that the farm workers made in exchange for certain other benefits in the bill. It's genuinely a compromise measure.
If I may, the mediation is optional, not required, but more to the point, this is the first time that H-2A employers will be subject to a federal right of action by H-2A employees. That is an economic boom for the trial lawyers, but it's a significant cost to the H-2A employers, and that's why you're seeing certainly a lack of enthusiasm in many sectors of agriculture for this measure.
Thank you. And Chair Lofgren, and I think Ranking Member McClintock mentioned it also, the issue of the wages. And, while this bill does limit wage increases temporarily, the overall cost structure remains an issue with the H-2A program. And are any of these long-term concerns addressed in the legislation in its current form?
Well, I think the biggest.
Go ahead, Tom.
The biggest long-term concern is the fact that the green cards issued to farm workers' families will be used in direct competition, not in the agricultural sector, but in other sectors of the economy, any other sectors of the economy. And the work requirement in for the CAW applicant themselves is fairly minimal, and that gives them the ability to also enter the U.S. labor market and undercut American wages. This is why we had, one of the reasons why we had wage stagnation for blue-collar workers throughout the last several decades. The Trump administration finally reversed that. And now we see that success is being returned to the bad old days when American workers simply can't get ahead because there is a constant stream of low-wage immigrant labor entering the marketplace.
If I may, I think there's good reason why more than 350 farm labor employers are supporting this bill. And it's because it's in the interests of farmers and dairymen across the United States that the H-2A program be streamlined in this way, and that they have access to a reliable workforce in the ag sector. We all know that after the so-called Reagan amnesty in 1986 that provided green cards to ag workers, very few went outside of ag to take other jobs. And if you take a look at the demographics of farm workers, for example, right now, the average age of a non-citizen farm worker in the United States is 42 years old. Under this bill, the applicant has 10 years of prior farm work. She has to complete at least 4 more years of farm work for a total of 14 years. And then she's in, or he is in, this status for a considerable period of time. So individuals really, when at bottom line, have 10 to 18 years of agricultural work experience are unlikely to leave agriculture. Now, maybe some will, but that's the life that they know. And we don't have, indentured servitude in this country. If, 20 years later, you have a green card and you have a different opportunity, you might take it. But the reality is that if you've worked your whole life in agriculture, chances are you're going to continue to do that. And that has, in fact, what's been the case in the past. And I thank you for asking the question.
And one final question. The legislation in its current form places caps on year-round visas, but there are plenty of industries within the ag sector that need year-round work. And would placing caps create a zero-sum game for workforce needs between, for example, the dairy industry and hog producers in particular in my district?
Here's what we did, and because it's new, we extended the H-2A program to year-round because, as you've pointed out, certain animal husbandry industries are excluded as a matter of practicality from the program. They're not seasonal. The dairy industry is very enthused about this change, along with hogs and certain others. But we have a cap because we don't know how it's going to work. However, we have the capacity to administratively raise that cap in 2 years if it turns out that there is not enough visas to meet the need. And so we know it's hard to get bills through Congress. This has been 25 years that we've been working on a farm labor bill. But to allow the Department of Labor and Department of Agriculture to actually up that limit if we are unable, if it doesn't meet the need, we did that to improve the situation should that not be sufficient. We, in a way, we're in new territory here.
Well, and as a follow-up, and I'll let Ranking Member McClintock, and I will just throw this out, and maybe I would ask, and what determines if need is being met? What's the bar? And Ranking Member, you can go ahead, and then if I could get that question answered too.
Well, I was going to say, first of all, with regard to the green cards issued to these CAW participants, they're not counted in the annual green card limit. There is no offset. And on top of that, it creates a new allocation of 40,000 green cards per year for unskilled laborers and H-2A visa holders. I'd also point out under the provisions of this bill, you only have to work 575 hours in agriculture in order to qualify. After that, you're free to take that green card to other employers. And again, the question becomes, how many new low-wage workers can our economy absorb at a time when it has been staggering under these lockdowns, is trying to recover, and Americans are trying to make up for a year of lost wages. And this is the moment in time the Democrats have chosen to open the floodgates. At some point, somebody has to ask who's looking out for American workers. It's certainly not the Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Okay, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question for Chair Lofgren. I've got thousands of Dreamers and TPS status people in my district. So I pay close attention to this, and I hear politicians all across the spectrum saying the immigration system is broken. We've got to fix it. It's time for us to legislate. And yet, anytime that we get close through the arduous efforts of you and others who are trying to bring us together, it seems to break down. And I just wonder if you could diagnose what is our malady. I mean, everybody articulates the value that we are a nation of immigrants. On our committee, I think with the exception of our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cole, all of us would trace our families to people who emigrated to the United States. So we all understand the imperfect nature of that odyssey for families to get here. Why can't we just have a big breakthrough and make this work for America?
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Raskin. We have a long history in the United States of once one immigrant group is here trying to bar the next group. My ancestors hail from primarily Sweden and Ireland, and there was a time when the Irish were not welcome in the United States. No Irish need apply. There was a time when people from China were prohibited from coming in, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, having all of us people, with the exception of those who are of Native American stock, trying to keep anyone else from coming in, that's a long American tradition. Fortunately, we have overcome that tradition repeatedly, much to the benefit of the United States, because the United States is really the only country in the world where everybody's family, with the exception of the Native Americans, came from someplace else. And it's what has made us really one of the best country in the world, in my judgment. We are unique in that ability. So we've tried now for 25 years to try and make changes in our laws that allow people to become legal, to cut through the red tape that we've created that makes it almost impossible for a lot of people to be lawfully present in the United States. And I can recall over the years shouts of amnesty. I just don't know how pertinent that is. What I'd like to do is think about what's in the best interest of the United States. And you think about these dreamers, when they were given temporary protected status, these kids that are really, they grew up in America, they're Americans except they don't have the paperwork. They just blossomed. I met so many kids, they were finally able to go to medical school. They were finally able to become a firefighter, to really contribute fully to the United States. And that's what I think we can anticipate if we allow for people to regularize their status and get right with the law and fully participate in the home that is America to them. Similarly, with the farm worker bill, we know that we have a tremendous reliance on essential workers. The pandemic has shown us more than anything else how reliant we are on people who are doing dangerous work in the case of pandemics. The amount of transmission of COVID among farm workers is very high. And yet these farm workers continue to go to those fields, get those that produce protected. It's why we can go to the grocery store and find fresh fruit today, even in the midst of this pandemic. And yet a majority of those farm workers are undocumented, and a majority of them have been here more than 10 years. So, I think it's in America's interest to regularize the status of those farm workers. There's not a line out the door of American kids wanting to go pick the lettuce in Salinas, I'll tell you that. And it's in America's interest to regularize some process for people from other countries who want to come temporarily work in our fields, take that money home. That ought to be a clean process that's orderly, where the interests of the farmers are protected and the interest of the workers are protected. And that's what this bill would do. And I hope that we can pass both of them with a bipartisan majority later this week. I thank you for the question, Mr. Rasko.
Well, and Chair Lofgren, I just want to thank you for your very long commitment to getting to yes on all of these measures so we can have an immigration system that promotes American interests and that is decent and humane. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent a district where 1 in 10 people were born in another country, and they are overwhelmingly a testament to the resilience, the hard work, the enthusiasm, and the economic and social benefits, which all the data shows that immigrants contribute to our country. I have to admire our colleagues' adherence to Republican talking points with respect to these immigration bills, but having represented immigrants and having visited the border and the Central American countries from which these refugees come, I just wish there was much adherence to the truth in those talking points. The dire conditions which drive refugees from their homes to the US border wasn't any less real because the Trump administration forced those refugees to remain in squalor and at the mercy of the gangs they now cite on the other side of the border in violation of US and international law. Out of sight, out of mind is neither an effective nor a humane immigration policy. And the allegation that the majority of asylum seekers who must first pass a credible fear interview at the border before they are admitted to begin the asylum process, the allegation that they don't show up for legal proceedings is, to my understanding, just flat out wrong. Chairwoman Lofgren, can you comment upon that?
Sure. It's a allegation frequently made but unsupported by the data. Recent data shows that asylum seekers continue to appear for court proceedings at very high rates. In fiscal year 2018, the Department of Justice estimated that 89% of all asylum seekers attended their final court hearing and received a decision on their application. Now, when individuals had access to counsel, those appearance rates are nearly 98%. 97.5% of mothers who passed a credible fear interview and were represented by counsel attended their court hearings in the 2017-2018 time period, which is the most recent data that we had. One of the things that I think people don't realize, if you are given a notice to quit and you're evicted from your apartment, you have to be given actual notice. You have to actually receive that notice. We changed the law in 1996 so that if you are noticed to appear for deportation, you don't actually have to receive that notice. It could just be sent to the mail to an old address. You don't actually have to receive it. So there is some element here where people never get noticed. If their hearing has been changed or moved to another location, they never find out. And that is a real defect in the system, in my judgment. But all these talking points, they sound great, but they're not supported by the facts. I thank the gentlelady for her question.
If I may, I do need to point out that one caveat that the subcommittee chairman made. Those that were represented by counsel, that's a tiny fraction of the overall amount, to my understanding, If you've got counsel, you're represented by counsel, you've probably got a pretty strong case. But my understanding is the vast majority of the total cases don't show up for court hearings and are often ordered, deported in absentia, and the deportation orders are no longer being enforced.
Let me be clear, maybe I was unclear. The Department of Justice data shows that 89% of all asylum seekers attended their final court proceeding. It was only when they were represented by counsel that that number rose to 98%. That's from the Department of Justice during the Trump administration.
And if I could just add, I mean, the data is consistent that when folks seeking asylum have representation, they actually succeed in their cases 30% of the time more frequently than when they don't have representation. But of course, the US government does not pay for representation, has not done so since the Reagan era. And that's one of the issues that we confront. Chairwoman Lofgren also anticipated one of my questions about notice being one of the issues that causes people not to show up. Our immigration system is so flawed that even when I have been representing immigrants in this process and have filed a notice of representation as an attorney, it hasn't been sent to me or my clients. So there are a lot of problems in the system that cause that small fraction of people who don't show up for their court hearings not to appear. But that does not mean that they don't intend to appear. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, do you have any questions or no?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the great hearing, the important topic. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank my friend, Ms. Lofgren, for all the hard work she's put into this and her opinion of trying to do what's best for the Americans, all Americans. And I would just question the argument that it's because of immigration policy by this administration or previous Democratic administration that has led to wage stagnation and inequality is not accurate. And we've done this in our history before. The research that I look at and the labor statistics is that this disparity is largely attributable to the increase in the capital policies we have done in the Congress and around the country, and the lack of regulation. So I just wanted to state that for the record. With all due respect to the ranking member, the disparity in wages and income inequality is largely attributable to increased value in capital investments in Wall Street and things like minimum wage. If we raise the minimum wage, that would help a lot of people. So just wanted to comment on that, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to thank Representative Lofgren for all of her work on both of these bills. In North Carolina, the success of the Research Triangle Park, which is the area that I represent, is largely due to the work of foreign companies coming to North Carolina, bringing their industry, bringing their employees, and then, of course, the agricultural success that we have in North Carolina is largely due to a lot of work from immigrants. And both of these bills will make an enormous positive difference to people who have been literally the backbone of much of the economy in North Carolina. And people have been begging for these bills. So I want to thank you. I want to just ask one question. We have a lot of highly skilled workers in my district who bring their children here legally. And then those children age out at age 21. And so they're not necessarily in the full dreamer category, but could you tell us how this, how the HR 6 deals with those children who come with parents on visas?
Yes. Yes, that is the one significant policy change that has been made to this year's DREAM Act. The 2021 DREAM Act allows the sons and daughters of non-immigrants admitted under the E1, E2, H1B, and L1 temporary work visa program to be eligible for conditional status. Those categories are treaty traders, treaty investors. H1Bs are people skilled in specialty occupations, and L1 visas are employees of multinational companies. You're right, you can have, and we had a bill last Congress that passed overwhelmingly in the House and got stalled in the Senate. The H1B program is for highly skilled individuals. You have to do a test of the labor market to make sure there's no American available to do the job that's being offered. And then the person is eligible for an H-1B visa, and their dependents are eligible for H-4 status. I'm just using this as an example. Well, then we do something that really doesn't make any sense at all. There's a certain number of employment-based visas allocated under the law, but we divide them up by country. And so you have the country of Iceland, which has a population of 350,000 roughly, and the population of India, which has a population of 1.2 billion roughly. And they have the same number of visas allocated to them. And so you end up with these big delays when applications are made for legal permanent residence, which again requires a pretty rigorous labor test so that you can prove there's no one here to take this job. And you end up with people from larger countries in these huge delays waiting for their visa number to come up, even though they've already been approved for a visa. It's taking so long that in some cases, their children who've grown up here reach age 21, and they're in a very serious problem area because they're no longer eligible for their dependent status. They're required to go home to India, but their parents are legally in the United States, so there's no one to go back to in India. They can't necessarily get a student visa because student visas require that you show an intent to return to the country of your birth, which they can't show because they've grown up in America. And even if they were able to meet that criteria, they have to pay foreign student tuition. So it's really a mess, and it's certainly not the fault of these young people who, just like the Dreamers, were brought here as children, went to school, did their best, got A's and worked hard, and now they're out of luck. So we're treating those kids the same as the Dreamers. They can go ahead and get on their path to legal status.
Well, I want to just thank you for including them. I want you to know that I've heard from dozens, if not hundreds, of them and their families in my district. Their families are really huge contributors to our community, and just another reason why we need to get this bill passed, get it to the Senate, and have it be law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? And before I dismiss the panel, I just want to say something for the record about process, because at the beginning, I think Mr. McClintock, you were engaged in a discussion about the process, that there were no hearings and there was no markup. And so one of the things that we did in the rules package was basically we said that, that we would review bills in the Rules Committee and bring them to the floor. In the first couple of months of this year, and we wouldn't require that they had a hearing or a markup. We're in the middle of a COVID pandemic, and we're trying to move legislation forward. Committees had not all been fully formulated. Now, having said that, HR 6 and the previous Congress actually did have a hearing and did have a markup. And I know, Ms. McClintock, you were here in the 115th Congress because I was on the Rules Committee. My Republican friends brought 66 bills to the House floor with no hearings or no markups. And one of the bills you brought was the Border Security and Immigration Reform Act. Not in the first couple of months of the new Congress when you were organizing it, but a year and a half into the Congress. You brought it before the Rules Committee with no hearing, no markup, and you got a closed rule, which you asked for. I might have missed maybe your testimony complaining about that process at the time, but I just point that out because I think it's important for the historical record to reflect kind of the accurate history here. So I wanted to make that clear. So I appreciate Ms. McClintock, you and Ms. Lofgren testifying. Ms. Lofgren, thank you for your work on this. I look forward to supporting it on the House floor. So this panel is dismissed, except for Mr. McClintock, who's coming back. I would now like to call our next panel to testify on HR 1620, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2021, and HJ Res 17, removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Subcommittee Chairwoman Jackson Lee and Ranking Member McClintock, we are delighted that you are here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Chairwoman Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your courtesy. Ranking Member Cole, thank you very much. All of the members, thank you as well for giving us this opportunity. I will abbreviate my remarks and look forward to the questions. As I begin, however, let me say that this bill was first or last authorized in 2013, and so it has not been reauthorized since its expiration in 2018, of which we have tried. The bill I wrote in the 115th Congress is now built upon many, many bipartisan Republican and Democratic amendments. And Mr. Chairman, the amendments that were offered in the 116th Congress by Republicans and Democrats, we have embedded them, included them in this particular legislation. So this is truly a bipartisan initiative. HR 1620 is truly representative of the members of this House, Republicans and Democrats. But it is also, we worked with, and our staff, and I want to thank them, with members who are on this panel. We worked with Ms. Torres on the Savannah bill, and it was passed. And another member, Ms. Harlan, on the Non-Invisible Act, and it was passed. We say that to say that this is representative of those who are concerned about the rising surge of violence in America against women. Just to add to where we are today, in the midst of the pandemic, 2020, the increase in domestic violence rose 18% in San Antonio, 22% in Portland, and 10% in New York. And in the Women's Hospital in Boston, the radiology scans showed from May 11th to May 3rd in 2020 that there were huge increases in the wounds, like the various wounds that evidenced domestic abuse. And that was higher than 2018 and 2019. I say that at the beginning to indicate that we are long overdue. And so I rise with enthusiasm to discuss HR 1620, the Violence Against Women Act of 2021, that reauthorized this legislation, first offered in 1994. And certainly we all know that this was a major legislative initiative of then Senator Joe Biden. As we all know now, VAWA is a landmark piece of legislation, first enacted in 1994, was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. This legislation was enacted in response to the prevalence of domestic and sexual violence and the significant impact of such violence on the lives of women. And frankly, they had nowhere to go. It is estimated that more than 2 million adults and more than 15 million children are exposed to domestic violence annually. This is why this piece of legislation is so essential now. The law has since been reauthorized 3 times, 2005, 2000, and 2013, with strong bipartisan support and overwhelming support throughout America. During each reauthorization, VAWA would make various meaningful improvements to the act to meet the varied and changing needs of survivors. HR 1620 continues that tradition, and therefore is intended to make modifications, as Congress has done in the past, to all previous reauthorizations. HR 1620, as indicated, is a bipartisan bill reflecting reasonable compromise, including our co-sponsors bill, Mr. Fitzpatrick, along with others. These moderate enhancements will address the many growing and unmet needs of victims and survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It addresses the needs of sex trafficking victims while creating a demonstration program on trauma-informed training for law enforcement. It increases access to grant programs for culturally specific organizations and ensures culturally specific organizations are included in the development and implementation of service, education, training, and other grants. It adds a purpose area to assist communities in developing alternatives to housing ordinance that punish survivors for seeking law enforcement intervention. HR 1620 expands protections for vulnerable populations such as youth, survivors without shelter, Native American women, LGBTQ. It ensures deaf people are included in grants relating to people with disabilities. The bill is supported by the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence Against Women, a coalition of more than 200 domestic violence groups. This is a very important piece of legislation that has expired, as I said earlier, since September 30, 2018, and we have yet been able to reauthorize. The bill we wrote in that time frame now is a combined, strong initiative of many voices. And as I have heard from my law enforcement in my own district and across the nation, the domestic violence call is the most dangerous call, or one of the most dangerous calls that any law enforcement can make. We are gratified that in this bill, we have particular emphasis on men and boys and changing the culture of violence against women. We look forward to the committee's questions, and we hope that we will move this bill forward as quickly as possible to be passed by the United States Congress and signed by the President. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. McClintock. You got to unmute, Mr. Mc. Oh, okay.
There we go.
There you go.
Mr. Chairman, first let's be clear on the broad principles upon which we agree. That every woman is equal to every man in their rights under law. That every woman has a right to be safe from violence, including in their domestic relationships, and that every woman has the right to equal opportunity and equal justice under law. But the bills before us don't address these principles. So let's start with HRES 17, the resolution to extend the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was considered extensively in the 1970s. It was ultimately rejected by the states as duplicative of the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. These provisions already guarantee that all Americans receive equal protection under law, and indeed it is through these provisions that our society has reached this point today. Both men and women have relied on these very amendments countless times to vindicate their rights in court. But it wasn't merely because the ERA's provisions duplicated fundamental rights already enshrined in our Constitution, but rather because of a reasonable fear that its provisions could open vast new vistas of activist litigation that would bring a wide range of unintended and unwanted consequences, ranging from concerns over everything from abortion to religious liberty. The worst thing about this resolution, though, is that it undermines the very rule of law that preserves these rights and the liberty that accompanies them. Article 5 of the Constitution empowers Congress to propose amendments to the Constitution by a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. Setting a deadline for ratification is part of Congress's authority to determine the mode of ratification under Article 5. Including a deadline for ratification of the ERA was not new or controversial then or now. After Congress proposes an amendment, the amendment is then sent to the states for ratification. 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment in order for it to become effective. Now, the ERA was proposed by Congress in 1972. The amendment gave the states 7 years until 1979 to ratify it. The required number of states did not ratify the ERA before the deadline expired. Now, the District Court for the District of Columbia reiterated this fact less than a few weeks ago when it denied an effort by Virginia, Nevada, and Illinois to force the adoption of the ERA well after the deadline for ratification had passed. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who supported the ERA, did not support the notion that the deadline should be extended. She said a number of states have withdrawn their ratification. So if you count a latecomer on the plus side, how can you disregard states that said we've changed our minds, end quote. This measure is brazenly unconstitutional. If the majority were serious, they would reintroduce the ERA and debate it openly and constitutionally, as Ginsburg suggested. We also have HR 1620, which does far more than merely reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. In reality, it expands and alters the fundamental nature of that act. Nearly 3 decades ago, the Violence Against Women Act was first signed into law with overwhelming bipartisan support. In 2000 and 2005, VAWA was reauthorized again, with wide bipartisan support. It simply made domestic violence a federal crime. But more recent iterations of this law, however, have strayed farther and farther from its original purpose into the woke world in which genders become optional and the laws become fluid. Most troubling, HR 1620 jeopardizes the safety and well-being of women. It extends services to men who identify as women, allowing them to crowd shelters and programs meant to protect vulnerable women from recovering from abuse. It expands the definition of domestic violence to include economic and emotional duress, reallocating funding away from combating the severity of violent crimes. It denies faith-based exemptions for grant recipients, which could force many shelters and legal aid centers for abused women to close. And it imposes lifelong denial of Second Amendment rights to such offenses as misdemeanor convictions for tweets that cause emotional distress. In December 2018, Republicans tried to reauthorize this law, but were blocked by the Democrats. Months later, the destructive lockdown orders across the country brought a dramatic increase in domestic violence, trapping spouses in their houses with an abuser 24/7. And we now know the lockdowns did little to slow the spread of the virus. Women combating violent crimes need a fully funded, responsive police force. They need Democrat governors to lift stay-at-home orders. And they deserve greater access to the means of self-defense, not more restrictions. Most of all, they need a reauthorization of the law in its original form, which is simple, no-nonsense crime of domestic violence. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I support both these measures. I have no questions. I yield to Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It'll be a little more complex from my standpoint for a variety of reasons. First, I want to thank my friend, the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, whose commitment in this area is without question and who's done a lot of great legislation. And I particularly commend her for mentioning the Not Invisible Act. People won't know this, that actually was the first act that was supported bipartisan. We had two Native American women, two Native American men, and it's the first time all four were on the same legislation, and the gentlelady was tremendous in helping us get that through, and we're very grateful for that. And I approach VAWA first and foremost, from the standpoint of us being a strong supporter. I've supported every time it's come up that I've been in Congress. And did last time, even though it fell foul along partisan lines. And I think my friend, Mr. McClintock, makes a lot of good points, and that there are areas here that make it less and less bipartisan and more contentious. I've always looked at it from the standpoint, actually, in full disclosure, Mr. Chairman, you would know this, a number of our members on this panel, or excuse me, in this committee wouldn't. Gosh, I helped bring down the Republican House bill when we were in the majority in 2013 and worked from this committee within Speaker Boehner to set up a system that if our bill failed, that the Democratic Senate bill, which I thought was far superior, incorporated the first protections for Native women that we'd seen, would come up for a vote and then help get the Republican votes when Democrats were in the minority to pass it and move it on to President Obama to be signed. So when I talk about this legislation, I talk about it as a supporter, and I address my remarks to other supporters and say, whether you mean to do this or not, sometimes you're narrowing this bill so much. That's what I warned would happen in 2019, that whether we could pass it through the House or not, what you were putting into it would mean it would not be reauthorized in the Senate. And indeed, there were things I objected to that were in that bill, and I made that apparent on the floor, but I still went ahead and supported the legislation. And I suspect I'll find myself in that situation again, because again, there's some tremendous improvements in the 18, I said 19, I think, but 2018 version of the bill that ought to be included. Certainly from a Native standpoint, we expanded it to children. We included protections for law enforcement, tribal law enforcement officers. There are a lot of really good things in there. But there were other things that I knew would cost votes in the House, and they did, and would cost votes in the United States Senate, which would be decisive since it was Republican. And remember, this isn't going through by reconciliation, my friends. This really is going to have to get to 60 in the other chamber. So do what you want here, But at the end of the day, making ourselves feel good by passing something here doesn't mean much if it doesn't get through the United States Senate and get signed by the president. And I doubt any president would be more anxious to sign this than President Biden, who, as my good friend, distinguished gentlelady from Texas pointed out, is actually the original, creator of the idea. And I worked with him in 2013 when he was vice president. To get this through, and a lot of other Republicans too. By the way, did. My good friend Darrell Issa was particularly helpful on the Judiciary Committee, even though the majority of our members had a different point of view. So let me just open up with saying that my biggest fear about this bill is that my friends will make themselves so happy in their caucus that they can't pass it in the United States Senate, and we'll go through another 2 years where we simply extend what we have. We do something, and that means the good parts of these bill that genuinely are bipartisan don't happen either. It's not as if just doing what we had is good enough. I mean, I want to see a lot of the good work of my friends on the other side actually come to fruition, but I doubt it's going to do it in this form. So I just say that it's a long iteration, and I say that as somebody who will vote for the bill. But just look at me as somebody in your huddle that's telling you, hey, I know you're throwing deep. You're not going to complete the pass. Their secondary is better than you think. Let's take the first down. We can hit the flat, get about 12 yards, move down the road. You didn't do it last time, and you threw deep, and it was intercepted. I'm afraid we're headed toward that again. So forgive me for my football analogy, but my mask reveals my preferences. On it's an important issue to me, and to my good friend from Texas. I raised this last time. I asked if there were any provisions to prevent a woman from being forced to have an abortion on the basis of an unborn child's sex. That actually is a problem. We have people that have a strong preference that tends to be for males, and they use that, and I was told it was not germane. I think it is. Has that been addressed in any way in this current iteration of the legislation?
Well, first of all, let me thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. We have worked quite extensively together. And if I might, as I answer your question, because I think it is clearly an important one, might I raise my support for HRES 17, introduced by Jackie Spear with 209 co-sponsors, the ERA amendment to become part of the Constitution. The resolution, as you well know, provides that notwithstanding the ratification of deadline of 1979 that Congress set for the ERA and later extended to 1982, that the ERA shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution whenever ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. And the purpose of the ERA is simple and fundamental. It ensures that everyone is treated equally under the law, regardless of sex, gender. Almost 100 years ago, Alice Paul, who helped to lead the campaign to secure women's rights to vote, proposed the first version of the ERA. And she and her fellow suffragists made the point of it. In 1971 and 1972, the House and Senate passed the ERA by well more than the constitutionally mandated 2/3 majority in each chamber. And so as we went through this throughout the states, we managed to get all but 3 states. Thankfully, the momentum for the ERA ratification picked up, and Nevada ratified the ERA in 2017. Illinois followed suit the next year, and then January in 2020, and Virginia made history and became the 38th state. Unfortunately, a district court ruled 2 weeks ago that these states were too late because of the ratification deadline that the Congress said had expired already in 1982. But it indicated it was Congress' deadline, and so Congress can change the deadline. Importantly, that court affirmed that Congress had the power to set ratification deadlines as Article 5 of the Constitution, which governs the constitutional amendment process. By removing the ratification deadline that Congress set previously, HRES 17 ensures that the recent ratification by Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia are counted. I think all of us can say that the ERA is a crucial bill. To the question of the gentleman, and I rise to support it, no, there is nothing in the ERA. As you well know, the Constitution already provides.
I wasn't talking about the ERA. I was talking about the Violence Against Women Act.
Then in the Violence Against Women Act, there is nothing in here that forces anyone to secure an abortion, Mr. Cole.
there's nothing that prevents anybody from that. It's not, we don't make it illegal to do that. Is that correct?
But you're right, because you're right as it relates to abortion. I'm not going to speak to the specific question. This has nothing to do with the question you raised. We do know that the Constitution protects a woman's right to privacy. And nothing in this legislation has anything to do or forces anyone to engage in any abortion process.
I'm not trying to force anybody. I'm trying to protect them from being forced. But that's it's just a difference we have on this, and it won't prevent me from supporting the legislation. But I think you might get some more support if you thought about that a little bit and considered it.
If I might, Ms. Cole,
go right ahead. Of course.
It's an important question. Let me try to give comfort to you and others. This bill focuses directly on the question of the violence against women in a myriad of areas, from sexual trafficking to sexual assault to domestic violence to stalking. We're very proud of the concepts that we use in this legislation. As I peruse the legislation consistently, and I wrote the legislation when we were trying to pass it in 2018, my recollection is the Judiciary Committee did not allow the bill to go forward, and the bill that was offered or proposed by Republicans, they never presented a bill. So we were stuck. But in reviewing the bill, writing the bill, working with staff to write the bill, we don't have any coercive measures in here about someone as it relates to an abortion, nor do we believe that we are in a position that we are not protecting women with their rights. Abortion, obviously, in this nation is not forced. It is a choice of the woman, her own religious beliefs, family, and her medical doctor. So there's nothing here that alters any choices made for abortion.
Thank you very much. Mr. McClintock, do you have a perspective on that you'd care to share?
Well, I think you're correct. I don't think there's anything in the bill that would forbid abortions for sex selection. I think that was your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just raised that as a humble suggestion from a supporter of the bill as opposed to an opponent. It's something you want to think about. Let me turn, and again, I want to end on VAWA at this point as somebody who fully intends to vote for the bill, and the majority of my colleagues won't. And you're not going to get it through the Senate the way you're writing it. So again, I hope everybody feels good about it, and it's important to make your points, but I thought the aim of legislation was actually get it into law. And I would rather take, 80, 90% of something, which this is a good bill. There's a lot of good things in here. But there's also a lot of things that Mr. McClintock pointed out, and I would agree with him on, that are going to give a lot of people pause. And it's too bad that we've taken a legislation that in its original form, as Mr. McClintock pointed out, and I'm talking about the original Violence Against Women Act, was overwhelmingly bipartisan and popular. And the next reauthorization was too, but we've slipped off the rails here in subsequent reauthorizations. And I don't know if that's by design or not, but what it resulted in last time was not getting a bill, not getting it through the Senate. And it's my hope we don't make that mistake again, but it's my expectation if this bill stays as it is, we will. And that's just, that's too bad. That's a sign of dysfunction in Congress. And I'll point my fingers on both sides on that, but you have to take what you can get, not what you want around here. And that's my advice to my friends in the majority, who I will be voting with on this legislation, but probably with a little bit less optimism than they have. Let me move now to the question on the ERA. And you already pointed out, Ms. Sexton, you're aware of the judicial deadline, the deadline and the amendment having passed, and the recent district court decision, which said specifically, by the way, the deadline expired, the deadline's a substantial part of the amendment, the deadline's binding, and setting a new deadline requires 2/3 of a vote. And I thought Mr. McClintock was particularly effective in laying out the reasons why this is unlikely to succeed. And while I admired her as a person, I quite often differed with Justice Ginsburg when she was alive on her judicial decisions, but on this one, she had it dead right. Probably the right thing to do. If you want to pass something, is to go back and just rewrite the amendment and not try to undo history and change things 40 odd years after the fact, or recognize states that have joined the ERA and passed it, while not recognizing states that have now subsequently changed their position. I mean, I don't know how you do that. And again, this isn't an item that's likely to make a reconciliation package, although maybe it'll get some bipartisan support. But probably starting out clean again makes a lot more sense to me. Mr. McClintock, would you provide us with your view of that recent district court decision and your perspective on how to get off high center on this thing? Because again, I think we're in another exercise where the majority may feel good at the end of the vote on the House floor, but not likely to go anyplace else.
Well, I'm not sure there's anything that I can add to your already thorough analysis. What the court said is you at least need if a 2/3 vote sets the deadline, 2/3 votes required to change it. But I think Ginsburg's perspective was far closer to the fact. Once the deadline's expired, the remedy is introduce by that same 2/3 vote a new ERA and go through the debate in these times, which have changed quite a bit from those in the 1970s.
Well, so we probably ought to just put this on the regular suspensions calendar and see if we could actually get 2/3.
Well, one wonders about the intent of this movement. If instead of going about it the right way, where there's no controversy involved in the process, reintroduce it as a constitutional amendment, debate it, pass it by 2/3 votes in both houses, send it to the states, and wait till 3/4 of them ratify it within the deadline that's been set. That's the proper way to do it. And what we have here, I think, is a very insincere effort to create an issue out of a very unconstitutional process.
Okay. Well, I certainly give my friend from Texas an opportunity to respond to that.
I thank you very much. As I look at the case, and as lawyers, we are particularly sensitive to reading case law. Over and over in that decision, it says that it is a congressionally set deadline. The court affirmed that Congress had the authority or has the authority to set the ratification, even when the Constitution itself does not contain a deadline. So there is no requirement in the Constitution or House precedent for a 2/3 supermajority. The House and Senate have already clearly established that a majority is sufficient, including when the House passed this resolution by a majority vote last Congress. And as I indicated in my remarks, Article 5 of the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress to pass a constitutional amendment, not to set a deadline for states to ratify an amendment or to change an existing deadline. So my perspective on this, dealing with the Constitution, is that the issue was already resolved in 1978 when the House and Senate passed a joint resolution. And during the floor debate over the rule governing consideration of that resolution, a member offered a resolution that would have required a 2/3 supermajority for the extension to pass. The House rejected that. And as you well know, in 1982, we extended the deadline to 1982 and moved it forward. And as Jefferson Manuel explains, I'd like to go to a former president. The House determined by laying on the table by a record vote a privileged resolution asserting that a vote of 2/3 of the members present voting was required to pass a joint resolution, extend the ratification period for a constitutional amendment already submitted to states that only a majority vote was required on such a measure. So therefore, the precedent has been set and only a majority vote is required. This resolution, H.J. Res. 17, does fit within the four corners of not only the Constitution, but Congress's intent and the House intent. And I believe that we are within good stance to, again, pass the extension for the ERA to finally get to passing this constitutional amendment, which is long overdue. And I thank
Mr. Cole, if I could just...
I will come back to you right away. I just want to make the point. I appreciate my friend from Texas because I know she knows her stuff. You know, she knows her homework. But I'm persuaded by my friend from California. And I think if this were to ever passed, which I think is very unlikely that it would get past the Senate, that we'd find ourselves in court pretty fast. And I think heeding Justice Ginsburg's wise advice, which my friend from California cited, we probably ought to just go back and start all of the proponents start all over again. With that, let me go back to you, Mr. McClintock. You had a point.
I'll just raise the point that Justice Ginsburg raised, that nagging question: what do you do about the 5 states that have since rescinded their ratification?
Well, I think that is absolutely an excellent point to make. So it seems to me that, again, this is something that we're going to spend a lot of time on here. We do a lot of high fives on the House floor, not going to the Senate, not becoming law. And if it ever did, it would probably head for Supreme Court. Seems to me the simpler thing is to follow your advice, my friend from California, and just start over. You want to do this, start over, do it the constitutional way, and you might actually get something done. But I don't think this is likely to go anywhere. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman. Sounds like the theme here is equal rights under the law, except for equal pay and reproductive rights for women. That's unfortunate. To the young men and women on our committee, I just, have to say, it's not that long ago. It was my generation that a married woman like myself had to get a permission, imagine that, from their spouse in order to get a tubal ligation procedure done. In other words, it minimized my humanity as a woman to control my own body and put me in a position of an object to be owned by a spouse. All of that was a very disrespectful and offensive process that not only to me as a woman, but to my spouse who supports my position as a woman and as a leader on these issues. I want to thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for your support in helping us with Savannah's Act. As you know, the issues around missing and murder Native American women was caught up in a political debate with my Republican colleagues choosing to take up and prioritize cheese curds. I'm gonna say that again, cheese curds over the lives of missing and murdered Native women. But we passed that stage now. And last year, we were able to pass this, but it was only after a lot of work that was done by a group of women who refused to give up. Not just us here in the House, but a working group that we set up with senators. In the Senate, it was led by Senator Cortez Mastos. And we were able to, get some of the tribal governments into a position of neutrality and eventually support as we provided technical assistance for their concerns. So thank you for your support in that. I just, want to recognize you for your work in bringing this bill year after year, Congress after Congress. Eventually we will get there. Women will have their rightful place in the world where we are respected as equal human beings. And I think that you have led the fight in this in many ways. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Burgess, I don't see him. I'm going to go to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member McClintock, I've got a question about VAWA. Can you walk us through what the Judiciary Republicans did in regards to the Second Amendment concerns in this bill, and should we have any concerns over infringement to our Second Amendment from VAWA?
Well, again, the committee did not mark up the bill this year, but the principal concern I have with it is that it allows non-domestic, non-violent misdemeanor crimes to be invoked to impose a lifetime ban on an individual's Second Amendment rights.
Are you worried also that would infringe upon due process rights as well?
Well, an infringement on a constitutional right, almost by definition, is a due process question. The Second Amendment doesn't extend a right to own firearms. It simply pledges the government to protect what is a natural right of self-defense. So anything that infringes on that would be a great concern to the simple question of the rule of law.
Thanks, Ranking Member. I appreciate it. Chairwoman Jackson Lee, I want to go back and talk about the ERA. I know that Ranking Member Cole and Ranking Member McClintock were talking about the 5 states that have rescinded. That includes Nebraska, Tennessee, Idaho, Kentucky, and South Dakota. Again, they've all rescinded the ERA ratification. Does the committee believe that this stands?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And as I answer that question, I want to make sure that I as well respond to the information regarding guns in this legislation, VAWA. But this resolution that we are introducing that we think is constitutionally sound, we know it is constitutionally sound because there is no bar as it relates to Congress extending and revisiting a deadline, does not appear in any of the provisions of the Constitution itself. And as I read in the Jefferson Papers, that there is no supermajority necessary for the extension. But as it relates to the other states, if we extend the deadline, we'll have the opportunity for the states that have recently supported the ERA and for other states to, again, be part of supporting the ERA. I imagine, without speaking for those states, that there was issues of the extension and the fact that it had expired. But I believe clearly, if we want to have a whole nation, we cannot have a nation where women are making 80 cents an hour. We cannot have a nation where there is unequal treatment in the workplace, unequal treatment as relates to credit and banking. And so the ERA has to be in place to have just laws for everyone that is in the boundaries of the United States. I also want to take note of Title 8. You have to realize that domestic violence claims 2,000 lives each year. 70% of the victims are women. Most intimate partner homicides in which a person targets a spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend are committed with firearms. And so the bill just prohibits persons previously convicted of a misdemeanor stalking from possessing firearms, and it makes it unlawful for that person to sell or transfer a firearm or ammunition to any person they believe or have reasonable cause. That is to protect and save lives. And a misdemeanor stalking may sound mild, but stand in the shoes of any woman who has been stalked and then has the tragedy of being stalked and then killed with a perpetrator that has been previously convicted. I think if we look at this and we talk to law enforcement, they will join us in saying these are violent incidences. These are dangerous calls for them to go on. And a person with a gun that has these tendencies is a very toxic mixture. The Violence Against Women Act is trying to be comprehensive in dealing with that toxic mixture.
If I
Thanks,
may.
Chairwoman Jackson Lee. Go ahead. I yield to the gentleman, the ranking
Well,
member.
I just point out that among other things in the firearms prohibitions, the firearm possession is prohibited under ex parte restraining orders. So there's no due process there. The individual who's having his Second Amendment rights taken away from him has no ability to contest that. The stalking provisions go so far as to tweets that cause emotional distress to a person. And finally, this measure applies retroactively to convictions that occurred before the legislation was passed, which opens up a serious question of constitutionality from that perspective.
All right, thanks. Okay, we started talking about two different things, so I just want to get back and focus. So I know we were talking about due process concerns when it comes to VAWA. I need to go back and just explore the ratification issue in a little bit more detail. So, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, are you saying that the 2/3? Are you saying that the 5 states that have rescinded ratification? Are you saying those do count to the 2/3 total, or they don't?
I cannot speak for states that have rescinded, but what my position is that the idea of the ratification extension is to count the last 3 states and to let other states follow suit accordingly. That would include those who have retracted their particular stance on the ERA. That is why it is so crucial that the extension be given through the legislative process, because Congress decides validity of the ratification. We certified ratification of the 14th Amendment despite purported rescission. So I guess my answer is I am not making a decision on the rescissions of those states. Congress collectively can make the decision. As we extended the deadline, we can then make decisions on the rescissions. That happened with the 14th Amendment, and that will be a determination that Congress would make. So acknowledge those rescissions. Congress would have the right to do so, to be able to assess those rescissions and whether or not they are in or out.
Yeah, thanks. And to be clear, look, I'm not pretending like I have the answer to this. I don't think anybody does, to steal Secretary Rumsfeld's line about this is a known unknown. It clearly is. Remember that in 1981, as Ranking Member Cole alluded to, there was a district court that had ruled that Idaho did lawfully rescind ratification. Additionally, let's remember the Supreme Court has never heard this issue or has never had a ruling on this issue regarding the rescission of ratification. So I just think that it's fair that we don't know, and I think it's okay to acknowledge that we don't know. But I want to move on. Ranking Member McClintock, do you have, speaking about the ERA still, do you have issues or concerns regarding the Hyde Amendment and how this may impact the Hyde Amendment?
Well, I think that was one of the issues that caused many states not to ratify and 5 states to rescind their ratifications. Again, the concern is that the provisions of the ERA are duplicative of other constitutional provisions that guarantee all Americans equal justice under law. The question of the ERA was, what new vistas of litigation is this going to open up that were unintended, perhaps unintended? And one of those was all the questions surrounding abortion.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. I want to go back and just talk about VAWA briefly, Chairwoman Jackson Lee. So it's my understanding that in VAWA we have grants for what's being called alternative justice response, and from my understanding, what this would be, it would not be part of the judicial proceeding, but basically you'd have victims come in speaking with the alleged wrongdoer. And I got to say, I've got concerns. As you know, I was a defense attorney. I was a prosecutor in the Navy. I was a district judge. I see tons of problems with this. For one, I see issues of victims being re-victimized. I also see issues with statements being made, that could both be used against an accused in a setting. I could also see issues where a victim might make statements that would be considered against interest, then come back and face what could be a nasty cross-examination. Ms. Jackson-Lee, do you have any? I just wanted to see if you could explore this and elaborate on it, because I have concerns.
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, let me make a statement that in these two bills, and so I'm going to answer one or two questions along with yours. In these two bills, the guardrails of due process are not eliminated. They're not eliminated in the dealing with Article Title 8, dealing with the guns and the removal of guns for stalkers and under misdemeanors. Due process is in place. With respect to the situation, thank you for that question. We think that we have the appropriate guardrails because no person that has been a victim will be engaged in any discussions without representation. With tribal representation, an immigrant representation, a lay person that will represent. And with that in mind, there will be a guardrail or protection for that person to not be intimidated, to make sure that they are not uncomfortable, and also to guide the questioning such that any intimidation will be immediately responded to by the person that is the representative of the individual engaged in that interaction.
I still don't understand why we have this, because if we're taking these cases to court, which is the appropriate avenue for sexual assault cases, domestic violence, I mean, these issues should be going to court. There's no doubt about it. I just don't understand why we have this step. And again, I know that the victim may have representation, but one of the problems in the criminal justice system is sometimes the prosecutor is representing the victim, and that's not always the prosecutor's main focus. So I've got serious concerns about re-victimization. And again, I've got really big concerns about statements against interest. And I just don't know why this is in here, how it fits in the criminal justice system. I actually see it as a hindrance to getting prosecution, to get convictions. But that's it. Ranking Member McClintock, final word. Do you have any thoughts on this? If not, it's okay. I'd yield back if you don't have any final thoughts.
No, I think you've summed it up very well.
Thanks. And I'd like to thank both witnesses. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd yield back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. And the first thing I would suggest is that Mr. Reschenthaler get together with Ms. Jackson-Lee, because you obviously do have experience with some very fine points of the law and what might happen in a courtroom. And I know the gentlewoman from Texas is willing to make this bill better over time. So I would suggest that. But Mr. McClintock, you said something that surprised me concerning economic abuse. And you know, obviously you and I have differences on a lot of things, but we have agreements. And I figured this would be a place where we had agreement. We recently had a hearing in financial services about economic abuse and about the way that a perpetrator, an abuser, intimidates and traps and punishes a spouse or a partner by running up the credit cards, by making it impossible for them to leave the home, to really just making life miserable for them to stay in place. And so I was surprised when you said that. Can you elaborate on why you don't think economic abuse is appropriate here?
Well, I think those are everything that you've described is despicable behavior. There is no justification for it, but I think we need to draw a line between violent behavior and simply despicable behavior. It is violent behavior that we target in our gun laws. This takes it a whole new step. And once you've taken that step, I'm concerned there's no turning back.
Okay,
particularly when you're applying ex post facto, these laws ex post facto to convictions that occurred years ago and were not ever at the time considered to be inhibiting or to deny you your Second Amendment rights.
Okay, well, I appreciate the first part of your answer. I'm not sure I agree with your ex post facto Second Amendment part of your answer, but I guess where you and I differ, the economic abuse, the ability to trap a partner, allows for the violent tendencies that make up the rest of the abuse. And clearly, one of the hallmarks, and basically a lot of this stuff starts with the economic abuse. And so I feel like we're really actually getting to the heart of a lot of this by that provision in the VAWA. You and I differ on that, and I appreciated the first part of your answer. I don't think the second part really answered where I was coming from.
Where we would agree, Mr. Perlmutter, is once they have crossed that line, I have no problems with the provision of the bill, but until they cross it, I've got serious doubts because it opens up a whole new genre of excuses to deny people their Second Amendment rights, particularly without due process. If it's an ex parte one.
Okay, I'd say to Ms. Jackson Lee if she wants to chime in on this.
Mr. Perlmutter, thank you so very much. I want to again indicate this whole bill is framed by due process guardrails. That includes Title VIII as it relates to guns, and we know that guns and violence as it relates in domestic circumstances are toxic. As it relates to your economic violence point, you've made a very astute point. One of the elements of this bill is to deal with the crisis of housing. Housing can be considered an economic component to the life of a mother and her children. Economic abuse is if she is dependent upon this breadwinner. We see that not only in citizen-citizen relationships, but we see this with citizen-non-citizen. When I say citizen-non-citizen, it could be a person that's status, but not a citizen, a person that has a green card, and the individual whose name is on the lease, apartment, and or home can immediately throw this person out and also have control over that status. They can contribute to pulling that green card. Economic abuse is unbelievable, and it can come down on a woman and her children in the midnight hours. We see that constantly. We have a expedited provision dealing with housing just because of that economic burden that may be faced. So I would argue that it is a valuable point and a valuable part of the legislation. And I would also say that all of these are framed within the guardrails of due process. And to my good friend who we have worked with on judiciary, his concern points to the reformative justice of this. The meetings that this victim is having with community-based groups that are specifically dealing with violence. This is not random. They do it of their own accord. There are legal protections when they talk. And so they are protected from speaking against their interests, as he is suggesting. And as a lawyer, I am well sensitive to the distinguished gentleman's concern. But this is restorative and reformative justice, culturally specified groups that will talk to women as they desire. And so I think this is a very new and brilliant part of the bill. And Mr. Perlmutter, your point is well taken. It is very vital for the economic component to be in this bill.
And I thank you for that. I guess just to kind of finish the thought, I mean, the economic piece of this, Mr. McClintock, for me, really traps and punishes the partner, and really, puts a lot of emotional harm onto the individual. Just as I believe, tweeting and that sort of stalking and just really trying to harm the person emotionally. So that's why I support these sections. I understand you think it may be a bridge too far, going too far, and I get that. But I do think these are very important components, and I just thank you for explaining how you were viewing it. I'll finish by saying to my friend, Mr. Cole, that the football season is over. You should have been focused on basketball for your analogies about, instead of 1st and 10s, you should have been talking about layups versus 3-pointers. And, I think your words are legitimate that, we need to make sure that this legislation gets passed and gets signed by the president. And we can always go too far, but I think in the process, we should be okay. And so I appreciate the words to the wise, and we will keep those in mind. The last thing I'll say to you is you were worried about facing Villanova, which would be a tough game. But the problem is in the second round, you'd be facing Gonzaga, which I think is you'd have real trouble in that bracket.
Would my friend yield for a second?
Sure.
Well, we'd have real trouble with either one of them, number one. Number two, remember, I'm from Oklahoma. Football season is never over in Oklahoma.
And I appreciate the comments of the ranking member and the chair. This is very important stuff. I appreciate it being brought to our attention.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and it ends another episode of Sports Talk. So I now yield to Ms. Fishbach.
Yeah, isn't that very much like ESPN that we're watching? But Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity. And I don't have any questions in particular, but I did just want to express my support for the concerns and the questions that Ranking Member Cole had pointed out regarding abortion, and that Mr. Reschenthaler pointed out regarding the Second Amendment issues that are contained in the bill. It once again is a position where the majority didn't seek Republican input, and there's many controversial portions of this bill that will stop a lot of Republicans from voting for it. And if we really want to deal with violence against women, I think that the majority would have reached out and really made an effort to make it a bipartisan bill. And so I'm disappointed in that sense. But I do, like I said, share the concerns of Mr. Reschenthaler and Mr. Cole. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm surprised that we've got colleagues who are raising an objection to the Violence Against Women Act authorization, that there's a provision which prevents convicted criminal stalkers and people subject to civil protection court orders from possessing a firearm. And I heard two objections to it, Congresswoman Lee, and thank you for your leadership. And I want to just run through those objections to see if there's in fact any constitutional merit to them. It was suggested that somehow this provision denying firearms to someone who has been criminally convicted, proven beyond a reasonable doubt to have stalked someone, or alternatively has a civil protection court order handed down against them, is now being subjected to an ex post facto law. But my understanding of all of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the ex post facto provision in the Constitution is that it applies only to the retroactive imposition of criminal punishment. But this is not criminal punishment, is it, to deny someone who's already been convicted of a crime of their ability to possess a firearm if the government decides that they are a danger to people? Does that actually violate the ex post facto clause of the Constitution?
Thank you for the question, my good friend. There is no punishment that is rendered to this individual in terms of restraining their movement. If you take the Bill of Rights, they are not, their movements of, except for their civil protective order as it relates to the victim, their movements are still there under the First
Okay,
Amendment.
so they don't go to jail for a single day.
They don't go to jail.
They're not fined because of it. This is protective action because of a demonstrated connection between people who commit domestic violence against intimate partners or stalk them and end up killing them. We went through this in Maryland where there were numerous horrific cases of men who stalked women, and then it culminated in terrible gun violence against them. And we passed a provision just like this. So none of these laws anywhere in the country has been struck down as as a violation of the ex post facto clause of the Constitution. So then they turn to saying, well, it violates the Second Amendment right to possess a gun. But they're not reading Justice Scalia's opinion in District of Columbia versus Heller, where Justice Scalia said, yes, everybody has a presumed Second Amendment right to possess a firearm for purposes of hunting, recreation, and self-defense, but you can forfeit that right if you commit felonies, if you prove yourself to be a danger to the public. Justice Scalia himself was very careful to point out that the Second Amendment right, just like the First Amendment right, is subject to all kinds of reasonable time, place, and manner, and distinctions based upon people having committed crimes in the past. So are there any precedents that suggest that any of these laws violate the Second Amendment?
None whatsoever. And if I could just add a sentence to your analysis is, as I was beginning to say, the Bill of Rights is precious. All the Bill of Rights rights of that individual are in place. So constitutionally, we have not violated any constitutional protections that he has, and he or she has, and the due process is in place, and the individual who've been convicted obviously had due process at that time. What is done is it is the protection, we yield to the protection of the victim. We do not incarcerate the individual, but we take from them the very tools that would generate into the enormous amount of deaths that we've seen, the stalking violence that we've seen, and domestic violence. Yes, there's nothing in the Violence Against Women Act that denies constitutional rights.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for clarifying that, because I don't think anybody should be able to get away with asserting that their opposition to the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization has anything to do with provisions being unconstitutional. These are perfectly constitutional provisions. And moreover, I think they're dictated by public safety and public welfare. People who've proven themselves to be a criminal danger, who've been convicted in court for stalking women or men or anyone else, or have committed domestic violence and therefore have civil protection orders handed down against them, should not be carrying guns. They've proven themselves already to be a danger, and oftentimes explosive gun violence is the logical culmination of their obsession. So that's the only point I wanted to make. Thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for your leadership on this, and I think we can all proudly support it and continue to support the Constitution of the United States, and we should not be putting up phony constitutional arguments. If people think that stalkers should be able to have guns, then go ahead and make the public safety, public welfare argument for it, but don't hide behind the Second Amendment. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
I don't know that I can add anything to the eloquence of Representative Raskin, so I will pass. Thank you.
May I just add a sentence to that, Congresswoman, if you might? I want to reemphasize that these are convicted persons, and the explicit constitutional protections are laid out in VAWA as it relates to the convicted stalker or the convicted domestic abuser. And so we feel perfectly within the corners of the Constitution to do, as Mr. Raskin has indicated, to protect the victim by not allowing this individual to have a gun as it relates to their actions with this victim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I now yield to Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, thank you to you and to Ms. Jackson Lee for your leadership on these important issues. You know, when we're all gathered physically in the Rules Committee hearing room, the portrait of my dear friend Louise Slaughter hangs above us, and it's always a reminder to me of her legacy. But I'm especially reminded of Louise today, as she was the co-author of the original VAWA in 1994. Prior to the pandemic, a staggering 4 million women experienced physical violence at the hands of a domestic partner every single day. It's a staggering number. And that number, it is universally believed during the past year, has only risen as people have been quarantined and together. And domestic violence is an epidemic that, in my view, cannot be ignored. And that's why I'm strongly in favor of the rule in the underlying bill, which I proudly co-sponsor. The bill includes vital provisions to assist victims of domestic violence, keep guns out of the hands of those accused of stalking or dating violence. And I appreciate the conversation between Mr. Raskin and Ms. Jackson Lee on the constitutionality of it. It funds crisis centers like the Willow Domestic Violence Center in my district, which I work closely with, and much, much more. So we need to ensure safe communities everywhere across America. I am not only in support of the rule, but very much in favor of, and I think I'm proud to co-sponsor the VAWA Reauthorization Act. So thank you again to the sponsors and the people working so diligently and hard to make this a reality. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. DeSagne.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, for bringing this crucial legislation to us. When I served in the state legislature, it took a bipartisan group of women to convince our speaker to let us update North Carolina's domestic violence law, which hadn't been really looked at in a century. And what we learned, and this goes to some of the earlier questions about economic abuse, is that domestic violence and violence against women isn't just about hitting someone, it's about power and control. And most people try to leave abusive relationships 7 times before they finally get free of them, and they've suffered that abuse. And sometimes on that last time is when it is the most deadly. So I want to thank Congresswoman Jackson Lee for bringing this improved, because we are learning about this, and we are particularly learning more about this during the pandemic, Violence Against Women Act bill to us. And it is my great hope that it will pass with bipartisan support. I also want to thank the Congresswoman for allowing 2 amendments that I've offered. One that amplifies the housing issue and makes sure that abusers cannot come back into housing complexes and then live near the person who they abused in the past. And another to make sure that we have a way of identifying sexual assault nurses who have that particular expertise when dealing with acts of violence against women. And then finally, on the Equal Rights Amendment, I am heartened to see that it will be one of my first votes in Congress. I worked on the ERA when I was in college. My mother worked on the ERA, and women and girls in this country may finally get equal rights under our Constitution. Wouldn't that be an extraordinary thing? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question?
Mr. Chairman,
Who's that?
it's not a member of the committee.
Ms. Jackson Lee?
If you don't mind, for a few points that I'd like to conclude with, but I will yield to you and any member. I didn't know if a member had a question.
No other members have questions, so,
I will briefly summarize, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Let me, on HRES 17, make 2 quick points. One, it is well documented that Congress has the authority to extend a deadline. I noted that Justice Ginsburg, of whom we had great respect for, and still do obviously today, did make a statement regarding starting from the beginning. But again, it was her opinion. And I believe that the Constitution does not bar a simple majority vote to extend the deadline on this particular important legislation, and on the rescissions. That will be a congressional decision as well. As relates to domestic violence, I simply want to say, I don't think one of us have not experienced these crisis issues in our district. And I'm reminded of an individual who drove all the way from a northern state down to our state in Texas the ex-spouse of a woman who had started her life again with 5 children. And he came to the house, knocked on the door innocently. Children answered, and he came and shot the husband, the new husband, the wife, and of course, all 5 children. 1 child survived. 10 million adults experience violence from domestic violence. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 10 men experience sexual violence and physical violence. 1 in 5 females and 1 in 20 need medical care. And sometimes it is overwhelming, catastrophic, and lifetime of debilitation. And 1 in 5 female victims, 1 in 9 need legal services. And so with the numbers rising in the midst of a pandemic, with us having not, as a nation, reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act since its expiration in 2018, it is well long overdue. And there are people crying out for this restorative justice legislation that we have, in a bipartisan manner, put before you. There are bipartisan initiatives here. There's Mr. Fitzpatrick's bill here. There are amendments that we added in the 116th Congress from Republicans and Democrats here. I want my good friends to view this bill as one that will make its way to the Senate. And we will look forward to working with the Senate and finally to the desk of the president, who as a senator authored this legislation, and in tribute to the former chairwoman of the Rules Committee, Louise Slaughter. I ask my colleagues to move this bill forward, and I thank you so very much for your indulgence this afternoon.
Thank you very much. And just out of fairness, I don't know, Mr. McClintock, do you have anything you want to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe just a couple of quick points. First of all, free countries punish deeds, not words. And once we start punishing words, we start down, I think, a very slippery slope. To say that it is not a punishment to deny an individual their constitutional rights, my suspicion is the person whose rights have been terminated would dispute that. We have to be very careful about the precedents that we set, because the precedents that we set establish a path to future actions. And when we start modifying the penalties for people who are convicted of crimes after they've been sentenced, when we start defining non-domestic, non-violent crimes and treat them as if they were domestic and violent crimes, when we extend provisions of these bills to such things as former dating partners, we're establishing some very dangerous precedents that I think lead us in a very disturbing direction. The motivation of the original VAWA was exemplary. It is the finest part of our country, our belief in equal justice under law and equal opportunity under law. The provisions that have found their way into these measures over the years are very different and take us in a disturbing direction. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so everybody's asked their questions, so the panel is dismissed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And I think, Mr. Cole, I'm yielding to you for, I'm told for, you have a unanimous consent request, or? No?
No, Mr. Chairman, I do not. I just have a regular motion to.
Okay. Oh, this is what you did. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was misinformed. I will. All right. All right. So, are there any other members who wish to testify on HR 1868, HR 6, HR 1603, HR 1620, or HJ Res 17? That was a mouthful. Okay. Seeing none, this closes the hearing on all 5 measures. Okay. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant HR 1620, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2021, a structural rule. A member of the Committee on Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of.
Mrs. Torres, can I say, can you start again, because you froze for part of it, so we just want to get it all on record. Sorry.
6 pages long, okay? Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant HR 1620, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2021, a structure rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-3, modified by the amendment printed in the Part 8 of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides the following debate. Each further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, not earlier considered as part of amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 3, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report and may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debated for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on the Judiciary and or his designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debated for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Judiciary or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report or amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of the resolution. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of HR 6, the American Dream and Promise Act of 2021 under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-4 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of HR 1603, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021 under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of HR 1868 to prevent across-the-board direct spending cuts and for other purposes under a closed rule. And ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. 17, removing the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Judiciary or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the joint resolution. The rule provides that the joint resolution shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the joint resolution. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule provides that House Resolution 232 is hereby adopted. Finally, the rule provides, notwithstanding Clause 7A of Rule 10 during the 117th Congress. The period described in such clause shall end at midnight on April 22. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Does anyone want her to read it again or backwards?
Mr. Chairman, we just want to say that the minority stipulates the honesty and good intentions of the distinguished lady from California and recognizes these were technical difficulties, and has no suspicions about the majority's motives in this case.
So I will ask unanimous consent to make sure that the entire rule is, the motion is put into the record without objection. So at this time, the chair will entertain So at this time, you've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of amendments. Okay. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for the resolutions of inquiry. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your work to begin to reopen the House to regular legislative business by again allowing the consensus calendar to be utilized. But at the same time, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to begin the process of allowing other tools to be used, namely the resolutions of inquiry. As you know, resolutions of inquiry are an important tool to attempt to get factual information from the administration, which would allow our committees to more effectively discharge both their oversight and legislative powers. As I noted the last time we offered this motion in the 115th Congress, 18 properly drafted resolutions of inquiry were authored by Democrats and considered by their committee of jurisdiction. We are only asking for the same treatment that we provided at that time when we were in the majority. All committees have demonstrated their ability to hold hearings and markups virtually since then, and therefore the provision is no longer necessary. Instead, I'm concerned that the majority continues to keep these provisions in place to avoid having to address some of the real concerns members have on both sides of the aisle. So I urge the adoption of the motion and yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate the spirit in which he's offering this. You know, I want more than anybody here to kind of get back to normal. We're going to work on it. You know, we've made some progress, but obviously we need to make more. There's concern about, you know, floor time, and obviously there's been concern about members calling for votes and calling for votes on suspensions and other things. So but I want to get to where the gentleman wants us to get to. So I'm going to urge a no at this particular time, but I want the gentleman to know that I am sympathetic and I want to get back to normal as quickly as possible.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, number one, thank you for that sentiment. And I know it's sincere, and I look forward to working with you on that. I do think, you know, this is an area we can make a little faster progress. We ought to have a broader discussion at some point between the two parties, as the percentage of our membership that have taken the vaccine is, I think, something like 75%. I don't think we're that far away from being able to get back to normal floor activity, normal kinds of votes on the committee, and voting in a more normal manner. Indeed, I think you can just look at the congregation of members on the floor without any ill effect so far that I'm aware of. And so, again, I know that's where you're trying to get back to, and we're anxious to get back there as well. And this is a modest step in that direction.
All right, you heard the amendment from the gentleman. Is there any debate or discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli.
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Dusonier.
No.
Mr. Dusonier, no. Ms. Ross.
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any other amendment for discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have one more amendment from me.
Okay, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I would move to have an open rule for all these bills. Number one, as we've pointed out, that we do have 60 new members that weren't part of this. Number two, in many cases, they just take VAWA, where I'm supportive of the legislation in question. There are new things added with no committee process, no debate, no discussion. These bills aren't all identical to what we did last year. And so if members are going to have a chance, even members from the relevant committee haven't had a chance in that case to do things. So I think proceeding by an open rule would do that. And finally, I think it would be much more likely, again, as someone who supports what the majority or supports VAWA. I don't support every provision that the majority's decided to put in there. I think having the opportunity to craft it would probably help you a little bit in the Senate. I think we're going through an exercise, particularly on a piece of legislation I care deeply about, that is going to end up with stalling out on us. It's not going to get through the United States Senate, and we run the risk. Hopefully, they'll pass something over there. I'm very sympathetic. I actually participated with our former colleague and now Secretary Designate Howland, to try and bring pressure on the Republican Senate to pass something so we could go to conference. But we're going to have to get past messaging bills and pass legislation, which is going to take some give and take on both sides to create the coalitions we need in both chambers, particularly when we're dealing with a chamber that requires 60 members or 60 votes to actually move something. So with that, I think the open rule would help toward that end, and I would urge its adoption.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his amendment. I would urge no. Each vote takes 45 minutes plus.
We could change that, Mr. Chairman.
We have some members that are calling for votes on the most non-controversial bills that you can imagine. And to be honest with you, the idea of an open rule at this moment, when on these bills, which I'm sure some would want to load up with amendments. To be honest with you, I'd rather stick needles in my eyeballs than have an open rule. Let me urge a no vote on this. Any other discussion or debate?
Well, I'm going to press my amendment, but I almost withdrew it. Just the thought of putting my chairman through something like that.
Thank you.
But I'm going to press on.
This for all of you. The vote is now on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Me and the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I'll ask for a recorded vote, but I will point out, I think you're winning here unethically by threatening torture to beat your own people into line. I think if I were on your side, I'd probably have voted with you too. So
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
1 second. No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye, but I do want to say, Mr. Chairman, I'm pretty impressed with your leadership that you threatened to hurt yourself rather than your members to get them to vote for it the right way.
I didn't threaten to hurt myself. I said I would rather do that than go through an open rule on these immigration bills.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Reschendahler?
Aye.
Mr. Reschendahler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reschendahler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, now I have images of eyeballs with needles in them, and I can't get that out of my mind.
Well, that's what an open rule would feel like in the middle of a pandemic. I'm just telling you. Yeah, I'm just trying to illustrate it so you can appreciate it.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And then second, I would ask for unanimous consent to insert a Reuters article titled "Migrant President Biden Stirs Mexican Angst Over Boom Time for Gangs" into the record.
Without objection.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And then additionally, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 1 to HR 6. This is offered by my good friend and colleague, Mr. Green of Tennessee. This amendment clarifies that aliens convicted of a felony offense or 2 misdemeanor offenses would be eligible for deportation. Mr. Chairman, foreign nationals in this country, they frankly just have to abide by our laws. And those who commit serious crimes such as assault, burglary, drunk driving, and theft, they have demonstrated their unwillingness to break our laws, to not respect our laws, and they should just not be allowed to remain in the country. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would urge support for my motion, and I would urge back. Or I'd yield back. Thank you.
Any other discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the vote is on the Rushenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can I please get a recorded vote?
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier,
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee strikes Section 9 from the rule that deems House Resolution 232 as passed. And this resolution would make it to where a simple majority would be all that is necessary to pass House Joint Resolution 17 rather than the 2/3 vote that should be required to remove a ratification deadline from a constitutional amendment. And I am a little confused because my understanding of what Chair Jackson Lee mentioned earlier was that this was already established, that all you needed was a majority vote, and this issue had been resolved. So I guess I'm confused as to why we need this House Resolution 232 in the rule. But I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Yeah, so we did the exact same process in the last Congress. I don't know whether Mr. Raskin wants to respond or anything, but
I would just say, Mr. Chair, that Chair Jackson Lee mentioned that this had already been established, so we shouldn't have to do this again.
we need to do it again for this Congress, but go ahead, Mr. Raskin.
But I'm sorry, I couldn't hear Ms. Fishbach. Could she just repeat the point?
And Mr. Chair, I was just saying that when Chair Jackson Lee was testifying earlier, she said that the majority vote had already been established, and we'd already resolved this issue. So I think that this portion of the rule is unnecessary if what Chair Jackson Lee said was accurate, that it had already been resolved and that it's already established. So just as a point.
I think I don't know. I think I responded to. But anyway.
Yeah, I think you did, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right. So, any other discussion? If not, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Any of the chair, the noes have it.
I'd ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli's no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Eschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Eschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 10 to HR 1603 offered by Mr. Thompson of Pennsylvania. This amendment removes caps on year-round H-2A visas, simplifies the wage rate calculations, and makes other changes to ensure agricultural products have adequate access to a legal, agricultural producers have adequate access to legal workforce. Mr. Chair, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, improvements are needed to the Farm Workforce Modernization Act to ensure agricultural producers have adequate access to legal workforce. Mr. Thompson's amendment removes caps on year-round H-2A visas, simplifies the wage rate, and makes other changes. This amendment provides needed improvements, and I urge my colleagues to support this motion. I yield back.
Thank you very much. You've heard the gentlewoman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is no.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Eschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Eschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Seeing none, now the question is on the motion offered by the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, we would ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Torres?
Aye.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin?
Unmuted.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin? Aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Morelli?
Morelli is aye.
Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross? Aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Eschenthaler?
No.
Mr. Eschenthaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach?
No.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Mrs. Torres will handle it for the majority.
And Ms. Fishbach Mrs. Fishbach will hand it for the Republicans.
And so I'm now told that this may come up, or could it be as early as 4:15? I just, whatever suspensions end, but that's what it could be earlier than 5, so it might be more like 4:15. So I just wanted to alert you to that. So I guess that's it. Thank you, everybody. It was great to be with you. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.